attention here at Cape Canaveral.
Sending astronauts to space is a lot more fun than not sending astronauts to space.
T-minus 1 minute and counting.
And NASA should know.
Ignition.
For decades, the country that landed 6 crews of astronauts on the surface of the moon was the undisputed leader among spacefaring nations. But since 2011, after the last of the great American space shuttles flew, the U.S. has been completely unable to launch its own astronauts aboard its own rockets from its own soil.
One final time.
Instead, we have become a grounded nation, a humbled nation, reduced to hitching rides aboard Russia's Soyuz rocket at $80 million a seat. That all changes now. When a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket and Crew Dragon spacecraft leave the launch pad at Cape Canaveral carrying astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley on May 27th, an entirely new chapter in space travel will begin. The launch marks the beginning of the age of commercial crew flights, a great democratization of the space game, with private companies designing and building glittering 21st century rockets using 21st century technology and selling their services to NASA, leaving the space agency free to focus on its longer-term dreams of sending astronauts to the moon and Mars. SpaceX is not the only company that will be part of this grand new enterprise. In position to fly soon is Boeing's Starliner spacecraft, which will tag team with SpaceX in getting crews to and from the International Space Station. It is altogether fitting that the upcoming launch will take place from Cape Canaveral's Pad 39A, the same pad from which Apollo 11 launched, carrying the first crew of humans to the surface of the moon. Just as a new era began then, so too is one beginning now. America, once grounded, is flying again. This afternoon, as we broadcast live from Kennedy Space Center in Florida, I'm Jeffrey Kluger at the Time Magazine headquarters in New York. It has been 9 years since the final flight of the final space shuttle, which means it's been 9 years since the United States has had the capability to launch its own astronauts aboard its own rockets from its own soil. That's the longest America has been grounded since Alan Shepard became the first American in space 59 years ago this month. In that time, America launched 6 one-person Mercury missions, 10 two-person Gemini missions, 15 three-person Apollo missions, and 135 missions of the space shuttle. Every single one of those spacecraft had something in common that they do not have in common with today's flight. They were effectively designed by NASA and then built to order by a company it hired to do the job. The SpaceX Crew Dragon vehicle that will take astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley to space today will be the first privately designed and built rocket and spacecraft ever to fly human crew. History will be made by the mere fact that America is getting back into the space game, and more history will be made by the fact that that feat will be achieved in so different a way. We have what's known as an instantaneous launch window at Cape Canaveral today, and what that means is when this rocket takes off, this rocket can take off at 3:22 period. It can't take off at 3:22 and a half. It can't take off at 3:22 and a third. That's because it has to rendezvous with the International Space Station, which is currently in an orbit with a 51.6 degree inclination to the equator. That's a pretty high inclination. At 250 miles of altitude, the spacecraft will launch from an entirely different orientation. Basically, that means 19 hours of chasing the space station before the crew catches up with it. It'll take only 12 minutes to get to space. It'll take a full day almost before the crew actually docks. Bad weather scrubbed the launch last week or on Wednesday, and there is a lot that can go wrong when it comes to the weather. NASA has a whole series of rules on dictating when spacecraft will be grounded. You don't launch within 10 nautical miles of an attached thunderstorm. You don't launch within 3 nautical miles of thunderstorm debris clouds. You don't launch within 5 miles of disturbed weather. You don't launch within 10 miles of cumulus clouds. There's rule after rule after rule intended to keep the crews safe. Now, this isn't to say that people haven't launched in dangerous conditions before. They have. The Apollo 12 crew, which launched in November of 1969, was actually struck by lightning barely a minute after it got off the pad, causing the entire electrical system to drop out. So that was a cautionary tale. The shuttle Challenger was, of course, America's great tragedy in 1986 when Challenger blew up on liftoff, and a great deal had to do with flying in cold weather when the O-rings that sealed the solid fuel in the solid fuel boosters on either side of the spacecraft became brittle and burned through, causing the explosion that claimed the crew's life. So weather is a critical issue in any launch, and it will be an issue in today's launch, as disappointing as it was on Wednesday when the spacecraft did not launch on time. We have to be prepared for possible disappointment again today. Safety is paramount in a launch like this, especially in a first test of a first spacecraft with a first new crew flying it. Behnken and Doug Hurley will be wearing an entirely new generation of spacesuits today. The suits that were actually designed in part by a Hollywood costume designer, Jose Fernandez, who designed some of the costumes for Batman versus Superman and the Avengers. Fernandez has told the press that Elon Musk, the head of SpaceX, said, quote, "When people put this spacesuit on, I want them to look better than they did without it, like a tuxedo." It is a one-piece suit. It effectively is a spacecraft all by itself. A self-contained life support system for the astronauts. They can slip into it easily, and it plugs directly into the life support systems of the suit. We now have some interesting footage from SpaceX describing how the suits were designed by the people who designed them.
I think one of the things that was important in the development of the suit was to make it easy to use, something that the crew just has to literally plug in when they sit down, and then the suit kind of takes care of itself from there. So the suit is really kind of one part of the bigger Dragon system. It's really part of the vehicle. So we think of it as kind of a suit seat system. So the seat that the crew is in and the suit are in a lot of ways working together. And so it made sense that we were designing Dragon in-house to also design the suit.
Our spacesuits is completely designed in-house. It's built here in Hawthorne, California, in the same building as the rocket and the capsule. The spacesuit is custom-made for each crew member, and that is to optimize the fit for the crew member.
We definitely wanted to innovate, and we wanted it to look inspiring, but first and foremost, we wanted it to be safe and reliable. The spacesuit's primary purpose is to protect the crew in the unlikely event that the cabin were to depressurize. But the suit does a number of additional things. It provides cooling and communication to the crew inside of the suit. It provides them hearing protection. And the outer layer of the suit is flame resistant, so it provides flame protection as well. When the crew gets in the capsule, they get in their seats and they plug the suit into the umbilical that's attached to the seat. And the umbilical is providing everything that the suit needs. So it provides the avionics or electronics for communications, is providing the air to cool the suit, and then it also provides gas when needed to pressurize the suit. So it's really a single point that lets the suit do all the things that it needs to do. We designed the helmet in-house. The helmet serves a number of different functions. Obviously, it's protecting the crew's head and it's retaining gas like the rest of the suit, but it also houses the microphones as well as the valves that are regulating pressure in the suit. We had to design the gloves so that they would work with the touchscreens, but the gloves also still had to do a number of other things like the rest of the suit. So all of those things had to come together within the glove. It'll be obviously really amazing to see Bob and Doug in their flight suits. And I think one of the things that's cool about the suit is it's not just a piece of hardware, it's not just a suit, it's a very personal thing. It's Bob's suit and it's Doug's suit. And so seeing the two of them in their suits, using it in flight will be just a really amazing thing.
We're looking at a shot now inside the Launch Control Headquarters at Kennedy Space Center. There are actually three active mission controls operating today. There is the Launch Control Center here at KSC at the Kennedy Space Center. There is a Launch Control Center at the SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California. And, of course, there is Mission Control in Houston, which will take over the flight the moment the engine bells clear the tower. As soon as the spacecraft is free of the gantry, it is basically Houston's bird to fly in cooperation with the crew in Hawthorne, California. What we're seeing now is the area around the crew walkout facility. Down that small gangway you see right in the back, this is the ramp and the doorway through which historic crews have passed before. The first, right here we have the first crew to go to the first moon landing, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins. This is the Apollo 11 crew. This is the first crew to fly the space shuttle, Bob Crippen and John Young in 1981. This, tragically, is the Challenger crew at their walkout on the way to their flight. This, similarly, is the Columbia crew, the crew that was lost in 2003 when their spacecraft broke up on reentry. There have been many more successful missions coming out of these doorways over the course of decades than there have been these periodic tragedies. And we see Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley. This is from last Wednesday during their walkout, wearing the new SpaceX spacesuits. They are climbing into a gull wing Tesla, and one of Elon Musk's companies, on their way to the launch pad. We are told that on that flight, on that drive to the pad last Wednesday, their audio track included AC/DC, the Blues Brothers, and the Star Spangled Banner to get them into a patriotic mood. The look at the pad right now is not enormously promising. The cloud cover obviously suggests that there could be some weather delays again today. Of course, a weather delay effectively means a scrub because, as we said, we have a 3:22 p.m. instantaneous launch window. It slams shut at 3:22, and at that point, the crew would have to wait again until tomorrow at 3 p.m. What we're seeing here is the swing arm attached to the Crew Dragon spacecraft. That swing arm runs from the gantry, that scaffolding that stands next to the rocket, and provides the crew access to the spacecraft itself. The large building we were just looking at was the vehicle assembly building, where the rocket is, as the name suggests, assembled and uprighted. Again, we are back on the pad here. The sight of the flag waving as briskly as it was in the breeze is not necessarily the best indicator of ideal weather, as is this cloud cover. But for now, all systems are still considered go, and the flight is still a go for 3:22 p.m. We are seeing now astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley walking through those same historic doors, getting ready to be transported to the pad. That's Bob Behnken on the right, Doug Hurley on the left. Doug is the overall spacecraft commander. Bob is the commander of the crew activities, particularly rendezvous and docking. You notice that in the space game, everybody gets the name commander in their title. Nobody wants to be seen as the subordinate. Back in the days of the Gemini program, they were called not pilot and co-pilot, but the command pilot and the pilot for the same reason. These are the astronauts, of course, saying goodbye to friends and family. You note that in this time of quarantine especially, there's no physical contact. This has been going on since long before the COVID era. There have been crew quarantines as far as long ago as the Gemini program. The crew climbing into this Tesla Gullwing will be attached to the seats through the same life support system that attaches them to the seats in the spacecraft. This allows oxygen and other life-sustaining systems to begin running through the suits. Think of each of these suits as a freestanding independent spacesuit. They are now getting primed for the suits to be able to sustain them once those helmets are closed. Basically, once those helmets are closed, the crew will have breathed fresh air for the last time until they return to Earth. It will be canned air on their way up, on their time aboard the station, and on their way down. They now begin a 9-mile ride out to the launch pad. One more goodbye to family and friends, and then off they go for that ride to the pad. which is close to the last time we will see them live until they return to Earth, anywhere from a month from now to 3 months from now. Typically the ride to the launch pad has taken place in a sort of RV, a recreational vehicle, a climate controlled van in which the crew sat together. This caravan of Teslas is the kind of advertising money can't buy, but they are also sweet machines, and they are in keeping with the technology that's on display today, which is Elon Musk's two key companies. So it is only fitting that they will drive to a SpaceX space capsule spacecraft in Tesla a Tesla car. The one astronaut who has gone to the pad before in a little fill here. The distance, the mileage to the launch pad is a function of the fact that what the astronauts will be flying aboard today is essentially a 76,000 gallons of highly explosive fuel in a 229-foot rocket. That is a very dangerous machine, and all flights are observed. The viewing stands are about 3.5 miles from the launch pad itself. The somewhat circuitous route that the crew has to travel via NASA roadways to get them out to the pad is about 9 miles, which is why we see this long motorcade. During the days of the Apollo program, the Saturn V rocket, had it exploded on the launch pad, would have produced the greatest non-nuclear explosion ever engineered by human beings. So there was a 3-mile sort of no-go footprint stomped around the rocket. There was an absolute absence of any other human life aside from the astronauts themselves and the key pad crew technicians and the hundreds of thousands of people who watch those launches, watch from that 3-mile distance. Here we're seeing the motorcade approaching closer to the pad. Once it arrives, the crew will board the elevators that will take them up the gantry and to the spacecraft level at the top of the Falcon 9 rocket.
So that they can be on the pointy end of the rocket, getting a chance to go up to space. It's just a momentous moment.
And they're listening to some tunes too, I heard, right, Lauren?
Yeah. There are at least 3 songs on their playlist that are super interesting. The first is AC/DC's Back in Black. You know that one.
Yeah, well, who doesn't?
Right. Another one that they're listening to is the elevator music from the Blues Brothers film, The Girl from Ipanema. Oh, Leland.
Okay.
Got another career.
That's enough.
Career
That's
number
enough.
3.
That's
That's
enough.
right. NFL, astronaut, musician. Yep.
And, of course, they are also listening to the Star Spangled Banner, the Army French Horns version.
Now, we didn't have tunes in the Astrovan.
No?
And I know that the Tesla has a really kicking stereo system. Is that still the custom stereo system that's in the Tesla?
I haven't been in this one, so I don't know what they're rocking, but I'm sure it's pretty cool.
And again, just for some perspective, they left the operations and checkout building just a minute ago, and so it's about a 9-mile drive from there to the launch pad. It takes them around 20 minutes, kind of depends on how quickly they're trucking.
The other thing sometimes that you hear as you're in the convoy is the helicopter, the Huey helicopter flying overhead. And it's kind of also, you're thinking military, you're thinking really important things, and it's a moment that also kind of solidifies in you that, hey, something big is about to happen. And that whoop, 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 the sound of that Huey is just in your head, and it feels good that all these people are helping you get there safely.
Yeah, I think we heard that actually coming by
We did.
this building earlier because we were talking. I was like, I hope that's what I think it is.
And it was pretty low because it was pretty loud.
You could feel it, too.
I did. I could feel it.
I took this drive yesterday in my rental car, and granted, it wasn't in a Model X, and I'm not an astronaut, but driving to 39A, that same route, and trying to imagine myself in that headspace, it was pretty awesome. I got to figure out how to get on Falcon 9.
Lauren, we're all astronauts. We're in space.
That is true.
You just got to get on the rocket.
Yeah, well, Leland, there's a big group of people that want you there.
I think we should, listen to them.
Yeah, I'm all for it.
I think we should
Maybe we should make that a poll question.
Yeah. Well, we should all maybe go to space. What do you think?
I am on board. I mean, not literally right now, but I would like to be on board.
Lauren, would you go with us?
Absolutely.
Okay, poll question.
We have so many people watching online, sending well wishes to Bob and Doug. I mean, it started early this week as we were ramping up for Wednesday, and I feel like it's just been this buildup of momentum because, we were following along Wednesday, and now we're all following along Saturday, and we have people watching from home that hopefully don't have to work today and can really tune into what's going on here.
And we, as astronauts, truly appreciate all the support, all the social media feeds, and we think about, our families. We saw Megan and Karen there with their sons, wishing Doug and Bob well wishes and God.
Did you guys call me? The convoy is now approaching launch pad 39A, the historic pad from which Apollo 11 launched, from which nearly all of the lunar flights launched, and which is now leased to SpaceX for the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket and ultimately the Falcon Heavy rocket. We see well-wishers on the side of the road. We see the waving. We see the farewells. This is the critical moment when the crew will begin to take leave of the Earth, take leave of these ground-based vehicles, and become a part of the machine that's going to take them to space. When they arrive, there will be a short walk from the cars to the elevators that will take them up to the top of the gantry level, through the swing arm, and over to their spacecraft, which will be their home for the next 20-some hours. About 24 hours from right now, the crew will be rendezvousing with the International Space Station. As we said before, it'll take them only 12 minutes to get to space, but it will take them 19 minutes to catch up with the ISS, the International Space Station. And when they board, they will be aboard the station for anywhere from a month to 3 months. We hear these helicopters overhead now. You can see these, the NASA logo on the back of the Teslas is the 1970s worm logo, it was called, because of its squiggly sort of sine wave design. The worm logo has been taken out of mothballs and is being put back to use, along with the more traditional NASA blue round logo that is nicknamed the meatball. On what we're looking at right here, toward the left, what that structure that looks like a water tower is exactly that. It is a water tower that dispenses hundreds of thousands of gallons of water to cool the launch pad shortly after the engines light. The larger structure in the middle is the gantry that holds the elevator and other support structures. And at the top of the gantry, off to the right, you see that swing arm, which will be the gangway that the astronauts will walk across in order to board the rocket.
Blast danger area. Now, before any pad technicians, engineers, or astronauts enter that area around the launch pad, the SpaceX and NASA teams do an internal go, no-go poll to make sure everything is clear.
This storied launch pad, which has been the beginning point for so many firsts, is the perfect backdrop for today's historic launch that marks a new first and a new era in human spaceflight.
And here's a view from our gantry near the Launch Complex 39A. We've got another view of the convoy going by here. If I had to count up all the cameras we have all over the place for this, I'd be here all day.
That's a beautiful shot right there, looking at the Kennedy Space Center and Merritt Island and all of the nature around us. It's a big buffer from 39A so that we can be safe and launch our rockets off to space safely.
Absolutely, and a lot of people don't realize this is a national wildlife refuge. I mean, I pass turtles on the way to my car every day.
Yeah. Well, when we would run from the operations and checkout building, we'd have to watch out for snakes and for alligators, and so to be really careful about the wildlife.
We used to have one who lived at 39A.
Oh, really?
Yeah, an alligator.
Well, maybe we'll see him. We'll keep an eye out. Tweet at us if you see any.
Did you name him Worm?
Ooh, ahead of my time.
I don't know how an alligator would feel about being called Worm, Leland.
Yeah, well.
And we've got a ton of you following along on social media. Lynn says, as a fellow Missourian, we're so proud of Bob. Launch America. We will be watching from the Space Coast, cheering loud. And another comment, Godspeed and good luck, Astro Behnken and Astro Doug, hashtag Launch America. There you see the SpaceX horizontal integration facility. It's on the left of the screen now. We saw the front of it from the other angle. Or I'm sorry, no, yes. There it is. I was getting my buildings mixed up, so it's on the right now. Yeah, bigger building.
The other is the Falcon Support Building. It's where all of our offices are, and yes, you're correct.
Thank you for the correction, Laura.
There's our hangar. We process Falcon Heavy in there. There are other boosters in that hangar as well. And the rocket and Dragon that is on the pad right now was put together, or rather finally integrated inside of that hangar and then rolled out to that pad to go up vertical.
And there it is. That shot really gives you a sense of the scale of the Falcon 9 rocket. Those Teslas look teeny, teeny, tiny, making their way up there. And so as they make their way up to the pad, we're going to throw it over now to Hawthorne, where Jesse and Dan are watching the action. Hi, guys.
Ascent of the rocket. Another pretty key upgrade is the Dragon's new life support system. As you can imagine, flying humans requires keeping a habitable environment throughout the entire flight, and that means covering everything like providing breathing air, keeping the capsule at a safe pressure, keeping it free of contaminants, removing any carbon dioxide in the air, regulating the temperature, the humidity, all of these things, and also implementing that waste collection system, aka the toilet.
That sounds pretty important. The changes to Falcon 9 were small but extremely meaningful to meet NASA's requirements for safety for human spaceflight. And specifically, SpaceX had to prove a high degree of fault tolerance, meaning that small failures in the system would not lead to mission failure. Falcon 9 was already able to handle engine failure, but new emphasis was put on making sure that a failure throughout any phase of launch would not mean mission failure. And this goes all the way down to latches, control valves, electronics, wiring, and so much more.
All right, well, with the astronauts now on location at Pad 39A, we're going to swing it right back. Marie, Lauren, Leland, take us through the crew making their final steps towards the Dragon spacecraft.
Sure thing. So we are looking again at Launch Complex 39A. Just a few seconds ago, we saw the Tesla carrying Bob and Doug pull up to the launch pad. This is the site of so much history, you guys. This is where Apollo and Saturn V rockets that launched to the moon took astronauts from. I mean, this pad has so much history. Leland, you launched from there. What's it like seeing Crew Dragon and Falcon 9 there with the pad? With all of the visual changes that have been made? I mean, what kind of emotions does this stir up in you?
You know, when we got out of our Astro van, we stepped out and we just looked up to see this vehicle, and it was creaking, it was groaning, it was making noises, it was getting ready for us to enter it, to take us off planet. And you know, you get a chance to take a picture. Sometimes you stand there, you look there, you think about all the training you've done, all the preparation, and again, all the people that have helped you get there. And it's just a solemn, amazing moment for all of us.
And there's another amazing drone shot. Lauren, you explained this a little bit earlier about kind of how SpaceX brings the rocket and capsule vertical. Now that we see it, can you kind of explain that again for folks who maybe missed that?
Yes, of course. Dragon is actually processed a few miles down the road at Area 59, or Dragonland as we like to call it. We then put it on a truck and drive it all the way to the hangar where the rocket is. And so what will happen is we'll then we call it break over, where the vehicle's up vertical, we'll turn it sideways because the rocket is being processed sideways or horizontal into the hangar, lift it, mate it to Falcon 9, and then roll up those hangar doors and essentially pull the vehicle in the transporter erector, which is the big white truss structure that you see there. All the fluid lines, electrical lines, and everything are connected to the vehicles via the TE, transporter erector. And they basically roll it up those rails. You can't really see them. You kind of see them in the screen, those rails. Roll the entire TE rocket Dragon assembly up to the very top of the pad, pin it into the pad systems, and then roll it up vertical.
And we are about T-minus 2 hours, 57 minutes, 44 seconds and counting. In just a couple of minutes, we are expecting to hear a formal announcement that the crew is at the pad. Of course, we saw them pull up in the Teslas, and there they are. Looks like they've already gotten out of the car, and they are walking up to the elevator that will carry them all the way up to the 255-foot level, and then they'll have a couple of steps to get up to the level where the crew access arm is.
I have the AC/DC song in my head as I see them walking up.
You know what I was kind of jamming out to on my way in was ZZ Top, Sharp Dressed Man.
Oh, nice.
I was like, I don't know, that might be on my playlist if I were in there. There they are, taken in the sight, craning to see the top of the Falcon 9 rocket. It's 230 feet tall if you round up, and then Crew Dragon is another 27 feet from the bottom of the trunk to the top of the nose cone. So when you're out there in person, it's really hard to describe just how large it is.
Look at them getting excited. They're ready to get in the vehicle, get in the elevator, and make it to the top. There's some FOD he's picking up, foreign object debris.
Appreciate that. They're also wearing FOD covers on their shoes, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We want to make sure that they don't, track the inside of Dragon when they go in. And so right before they enter the vehicle, they'll remove the FOD covers off of their boots.
You take for granted, all just the little details like that, all of the thought and preparation that has to go into literally every single piece of this operation.
I love the makeover of Pad 39A with the sleek black with the white ticking and the lines, and it's a very futuristic look for this iconic launch pad. And to think what's been there before with Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, shuttle, and now the SpaceX Crew Dragon getting ready for a launch to the International Space Station. Rocket fuel still going through my veins.
And we feel so honored to be able to launch from here. Oh, here they are. That's a really fast elevator.
Yeah.
I know, it really zips. That took them up to 255 feet in just a matter of seconds.
They're removing their FOD covers?
Looks like they were just maybe checking something on his boot or leg.
And we should hear a call any moment that the crew has arrived at the pad as they make their way up the stairs, and they're headed to the crew access arm now. There's the worm again, popping.
You know it.
Meatball.
Don't worry, there's a meatball on Crew Dragon.
Those white arrows you see there are essentially illuminating the way for anyone who's up there to find their way to the escape baskets in the event of an emergency that would require them to get far away from the rocket and the pad.
And it's hard to tell from this angle, but there's actually a phone right here, and I can't tell if it's Bob or Doug that's using the phone right now. But Leland, can you explain the significance of that? It's the same phone that was there during the shuttle days.
Yeah, you get a chance to talk to maybe friends or family that you haven't had maybe couldn't come to the launch. In this case, it's quite a few people. But just to have that last moment to talk to someone before you get in the vehicle. It's a beautiful view.
And we're watching the crew when they're done using the phone there. We expect them to be making their way into the crew access arm. And coming up at about T-minus 2 hours and 35 minutes, The astronauts will ingress, or that's a word we use to describe climbing into Crew Dragon. And we saw Doug do it a couple minutes early on Wednesday. They were a little bit ahead of schedule, so that time could be a little bit flexible. But that's going to happen with the assistance of the suit techs, and they will get strapped into their seats. And so with that coming up, we're going to head over to Hawthorne for a preview of what's in store for the future in space travel. Jesse?
We've been listening to NASA's feed of narrating what is going on the swing arm, on the pad at the moment. They will eventually be throwing out to Hawthorne, California, the headquarters of SpaceX, to show some of what's going on out there. At the moment, we see Bob Behnken removing the foreign object debris shoes from his boots that prevent them from tracking any foreign object, any dirt into this pristine new spacecraft. It's sort of like taking off your galoshes before you come into the house. The astronauts are about to cross that swing arm and then enter the spacecraft. You can see over that NASA meatball logo on the wall what looks like a little bit of graffiti. That is where the astronauts signed their names, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, before boarding last Wednesday. This is the beginning of a new crew tradition in this new White Room. And this, by the end of SpaceX's at least 6 missions to the ISS, that wall is going to be pretty full of signatures. You saw something similar in the walkout scenes when they were leaving through the double doors during the walkout to the vans that take the astronauts to the launch pad. You could notice over the doors dozens and dozens of crew stickers, crew patches, each one indicating a crew, whether from the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, or shuttle eras, that have walked through those doors and gone to the launch pads. This marks a new tradition, autographing the walls of the White Room before boarding the spacecraft. The spacecraft they're getting into now, the Dragon, it's a young machine. It's a machine that's carrying humans for the first time, but it has a pretty robust history. There have been 22 Dragon launches so far, with 21 visits to the International Space Station. The spacecraft is capable of seating up to 7 people, which was the capacity and the maximum capacity of the much larger shuttle. It stands almost 27 feet tall and 13 feet wide. That's about the same width as the Apollo crew vehicle, but it's 2.5 times the height and the habitable capacity that the Apollo had. It is maneuvered in space by 16 Draco thrusters. Those are the thrusters that allow it to change its orientation and attitude in space. On the way back down, it descends under the power of 2 drogue parachutes and 4 main parachutes, as you can see in the footage here. It is a pretty adaptable system. We see it right now configured for just 2 astronauts, but again, it can hold as many as 7. The Falcon 9 rocket, on top of which the Dragon will launch today, stands 229 feet tall. It's fueled by 9 Merlin engines. SpaceX has an interesting technique for building rockets. Basically, they go by the more is more philosophy. Their very first rocket, the Falcon, had a single Merlin engine. The Falcon 9, as the name suggests, has 9 engines. The Falcon Heavy, which is one of the heaviest lift rockets flying today, has 3 clusters of 9 or 27 Merlin engines. Each one of those engines is capable of producing 125,000 pounds of thrust. So for this rocket that'll be launching today, it will be exerting the equivalent of 1,125,000 pounds of thrust over all It runs on RP-1 rocket fuel, which sounds very fancy, but is in fact simply a highly technical way of saying refined kerosene. And it also uses liquid oxygen as the oxidizer. This will be the 84th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since the very first launch on June 4th, 2010. And one great innovation of the SpaceX design system is that first stage is not expendable. The first stage of the rocket can be reused when it is jettisoned from the rest of the spacecraft after its fuel has been spent. It doesn't simply tumble into the ocean. Instead, it lands on a barge in the ocean to be refurbished and used again. So far, there have been 44 successful landings of a Falcon first stage on an ocean barge, and 31 of those stages have been refurbished and reflown. This is one way of keeping costs down and keeping the production lines moving quickly. Today's launch is the result of more than 10 years of development of the Commercial Crew Program. The initial idea was to allow NASA simply to purchase services of private companies that would fly crew to and from the International Space Station, freeing the space agency up to focus on its longer-term ambitions to explore deeper space, going to the moon, going then later on to Mars. Here we're seeing when the first commercial crew announcements were made, the crews were introduced. There are two companies that will be flying crews to and from the International Space Station, SpaceX and a been mentioned so far today, but very much in the game, is Boeing, which will be flying its Starliner spacecraft. It has one more uncrewed test sometime in the next 2 or 3 months, and then it has another crewed test sometime early in 2021. The astronauts and SpaceX have been through a lot of stages to get to this point. They successfully flew a pad abort test, which is what we're seeing right here. A test of the launch escape system that pulls the capsule away from a booster that may be flying awry or may be about to explode. The Gemini, old Gemini spacecraft used ejection seats. The Apollo and Mercury spacecraft used something very much like this. What you're seeing here is what would happen if a rocket began to blow up and the SpaceX crew compartment or the Dragon crew compartment would simply separate and then descend into the Atlantic safely for a quick recovery. This was one of their bigger successes, this pad abort test. They similarly flew a launch abort test in which they actually deliberately destroyed a Falcon 9 on the way up in order to test whether the spacecraft could safely get away from a rocket that was in danger of exploding. The company did ace that test as well. The escape system was proven. It showed that the astronauts could indeed be pulled safely away from an exploding vehicle. We see that happening now. That small dot toward the center of your screen is the crew compartment escaping. Now, not all has gone well. This explosion right here was deliberate. That was supposed to simulate a rocket that had gone awry. Not all has gone well. There have been some stumbles. During one of the pad abort tests in 2019, the spacecraft itself exploded on the launch pad, which is a very bad sign. And there was no denying the fact that that was a setback. Here is another setback from 2016 when one of the rockets was being fueled on the launch pad and exploded. We just saw that's a crash of one of the first stages as it was trying to land on a barge, failing to land. There were no injuries in any of these cases, fortunately. And as recently as yesterday in Boca Chica, Texas, where the SpaceX Starship is being designed, the 120-foot tall stainless steel rocket that Elon Musk hopes to use to get to the moon and then later on to Mars, there was a static fire test on the launch pad just yesterday, and there was another explosion. It was a poorly timed accident one day before Elon Musk and SpaceX are set to send astronauts to space. It does not necessarily inspire confidence, but these are two very different spacecraft. Starship, which exploded yesterday, is very much an in-development prototype spacecraft that is nowhere near ready to carry humans. The Falcon 9 is a highly proven vehicle with its 88 launches and its overall highly successful safety rating. So what we're seeing today is the result of multiple successes and a handful of failures, and that basically is how rocket engineering is done.
SpaceX Dragon, loud and clear.
Core, loud and clear. Teachers comm check complete. Standby with comm checks with MD and LD in the launch configuration.
Dragon, MD on countdown 1. Com check.
SpaceX, Jason, loud and clear.
Copy, loud and clear. Glad to have you guys on board. Stand by for com check on Dragon to ground. Dragon, MD, Dragon to ground, com check.
MD Dragon, loud and clear.
MD, loud and clear. Stand by for com checks with LD.
Dragon, launch director on countdown 1, com check.
Good afternoon, Mike. Loud and clear.
I have you the same, and good afternoon. Stand by for my com check on Dragon to ground. Dragon, SpaceX on Dragon to ground, com check.
SpaceX Dragon, loud and clear.
I have you the same. Back to core.
Dragon SpaceX, this concludes our launch configuration comm checks. Report when ready for seat rotation per section 2 of 4.100.
Dragon, I'll put that in work.
Copy.
All right, so all those communications checks were done successfully, and you could even see, and it's so cool when we get these views right inside the cabin.
SpaceX Dragon in 2.2, we are ready for seat rotation.
Copy. We will report when initiating.
But you could see Doug Hurley using his right hand. He has the talk button built into the seat itself. So just, again, showing you all of the different systems, how the suit is integrated into the seat, and it's all just one big circle for this whole spacecraft. So really cool to see those comm checks live. Jessica, thank you so much for walking us through some of the really cool updates, the upgrades. Did you have any other cool stuff besides?
Let's see. So I don't know if you guys can see, but we have the Dragon clean room here. And one of the coolest things is it is right on the main floor of our main building. So thousands of employees walk by here all the time and get to see Dragon in its final processing before it goes to the Cape. On Wednesday, the Crew 1 capsule was in here. It looked almost done. It looks a little empty right now, but that's because that capsule went off into our separate test facility for its final propulsion checks. So we do leak checks and things there, and we do that in a separate facility just because it's high.
We've been looking at Bob and Doug Hurley inside the spacecraft. Let's get to know these two gentlemen a little bit. Bob Behnken is listed as the Joint Operations Commander for the mission. What that means is he's in charge of the delicate choreography of rendezvousing and docking and other exercises as the spacecraft approaches the International Space Station tomorrow. That's a very delicate system. A small 26-foot spacecraft is approaching a great flying space liner the size of a football field, and mating those two vehicles is a complicated process. Bob was first selected to be an astronaut in 2000. He has flown 2 space shuttle missions, STS-123 in March of 2008 and STS-130 in February of 2010. He is a veteran of no fewer than half a dozen spacewalks, 3 on each mission. He was born in St. Anne, Missouri. He has a bachelor's degree in physics and a master's in engineering from no less a place than Caltech, and did serve for a time as a U.S. Air Force flight test engineer. Doug Hurley is the commander of the spacecraft. He, too, was selected as an astronaut in the incoming class of 2000. He was born in Endicott, New York. He has a bachelor's in civil engineering from Tulane and graduated as into the U.S. Naval Pilot Test School in Maryland. He was a fighter pilot and test pilot in the Marine Corps. He flew on, like Bob, he's been on 2 shuttle flights, STS-127 in 2009, and fittingly, STS-135 in July 11th. the very last shuttle flight after 30 years of shuttle missions. Both of these astronauts get a commander designation, commander for mission operations and commander for the spacecraft itself. It is one more sign of the fact that as collaborative and as collegial a business as flying in space is, these are competitive men and women, and nobody likes to be flying necessarily under the command of someone else. So they both get a little bit of taste of command. And we have some NASA deeper profiles that we can throw to showing you a little bit more about the astronauts talking about themselves and their own experiences.
Hi, I'm Bob Behnken. I am the Joint Operations Mission Commander for NASA's SpaceX Demo 2 mission. So Doug, Hurley, and I are about to take NASA's SpaceX Demo 2 mission to the International Space Station. During that mission, we'll perform some checkouts, everything from a response to a fire on board to flying close to the International Space Station manually. We'll make sure all those systems are working during the test flight so that the future missions will have them available even if they don't plan to utilize them. We're hopeful that future crews on Dragon vehicles headed to NASA space stations aren't cursing our names because we accepted some feature that was complicated and hard to train and in the end hard to operate. In the Air Force environment, flight test environment, there's always a balance of managing risk as you go forward to execute a test point and figuring out a way to collect the data. And do that in the calm, cool, collected kind of test environment with experienced folks before a pilot ends up someplace a little bit more complicated with a lot less resources. My role for a space mission is very much the same. My career at NASA has kind of spanned a couple of decades at this point. I arrived with the class of 2000, went through the training program, primarily focused on the space shuttle and the International Space Station, learning those systems through the assembly process, which was a little bit like where we were with Dragon in the early days, because Space Station kept changing and you had to stay up with it. After that, I was eventually assigned to a series of kind of training activities, both as a long-duration crew member and then flip-flopped over and flew a couple of shuttle missions, both on Endeavour. After that, I came back and kind of worked up the leadership chain through station operations, deputy chief, and then chief of the astronaut office. One of my goals was to try to get as many astronauts off to Kazakhstan so they would appreciate the day when we got to launch again from the Florida coast. Probably two things that jump out to me as kind of big wins. One is associated with having a high enough fidelity from a training perspective. Both Doug and I can sit in a capsule, we can put on suits, and we can go through a situation or a scenario where the suits are going to inflate to try to protect us from whatever situation is developing on board the vehicle. And I think one of our biggest accomplishments was a tool to be able to plan our own way out of orbit back to Earth. And we had to come up with a way that didn't break the software allocation that was out there. And we just had the big picture of, okay, how does the crew just get home if they end up in this situation? How does the crew get home if they end up in this situation? When they were able to flip that switch and not count how many failures it took to get there, but accept that let's figure out the easiest way to provide that capability, and they got on board with it. That was the aha moment. You don't necessarily have to save the mission with the crew, but you need to save the crew with the crew is kind of the mindset that we've put out there. It's really kind of designed that launch day is kind of relaxed. So we'll get up, have a little bit of exercise probably, or breakfast and then some exercise, be able to do some last minute phone calls. We'll probably have lunch, review, weather briefing of some sort to understand what our weather's going to look like. We'll hear anything associated with the vehicle, kind of technical detail wise. We'll get a little bit of an early read on that before the formal process of getting the suit on and then heading out to the launch pad. For me, having launched a couple times on vehicles, the The second time was definitely different than the first time in terms of relaxation associated with the mission. You're doing that for the first time, you can feel a little bit guilty of, hey, should I study one more thing, or is there one more piece of information I should get? So that's definitely different between where I was on my first flight and where I'm at right now. On a deeply personal level, I'm really excited that my son is going to get a chance to see me launch into space. Being an astronaut has been a little bit of an abstraction thing for him because he's seen me do it in old videos, but he hasn't seen me do it for real. I think it's important for the U.S. to continue to have these exciting things out there from a technical, engineering, science, challenge perspective, because it motivated me to go into this sort of a career, and I know that it motivates other children in. And so I'm excited to bring it back to the Florida coast, or be a part of bringing it back. You know, I'm just one piece of a multi-thousand member team that's going to hopefully pull this off in short order. It's inspiring to me, and I'm just excited to be a part of it.
What's going on in that white room? The portion of the swing arm that connects to the spacecraft that we can see, the sort of accordion-like black structure, that is the white room where the crew technicians, the pad technicians, are helping the astronauts into the spacecraft. What's going on behind that enclosure right now is the closeout. This is the point at which the spacecraft is sealed. While the astronauts have not yet physically left the planet, they have effectively atmospherically left the planet. They are now breathing life support air. They're being sustained by the systems aboard, the environmental control systems aboard the spacecraft. They are now, in some ways, in space. This is the way they will be living for the next 1 to 3 months aboard the International Space Station. They are now, in a sense, integrated with their spacecraft. They are part of the machine. The door is closed. There is no Florida air filling their spacecraft any longer. This is all the life support system of their suits, of their seats, which are integrated into the suits, and of the Dragon 9, or of the Crew Dragon spacecraft itself, keeping the crew alive. They are now very much in the process of leave-taking. Having checked in on the doings on the capsule, let's meet our second astronaut aboard, Doug Hurley, the commander of the spacecraft itself.
Hi, my name is Doug Hurley, and I'm the spacecraft commander for the Demo 2 mission to the International Space Station. This mission is the crewed test flight for the SpaceX Crew Dragon. So every portion of the flight, this will be the first time the Crew Dragon has had a crew on board. And so there's a myriad of objectives we want to achieve. Obviously, the first part is to launch the rendezvous and docking phase. And then we'll spend some time on board space station and do some docked activities with the vehicle. And then at some point, 30 to 90 days later, we will undock and do an entry and a landing in the Atlantic off the coast of Florida. It's a story. On STS-127, which was my first flight, I think we scrubbed on the order of 6 times over the course of about a month. It was literally Groundhog Day trying to get into space. And of course, it's your first flight, so you really, really want to go. We just had technical challenges for the first 2 or 3 launch attempts, and then had to scrub for weather a number of times before we finally got to go. That's why you got to go to the pad, you got to get in the vehicle, because you never know when the weather's going to clear. It's not the best of stories, but I think back so fondly on that mission. We worked really hard for 16 days, but it was a great mission once we got airborne. We first got down to Kennedy, we got every checklist out and every responsibility that each one of us had. We kind of almost tabletopped it for the first couple days. And you see that in sports teams. You see the coaches and players that spend that extra time after practice and at night reviewing film and going over films of the other teams. I think that's what you need to do in a space flight, is you need to know what you're going to do almost instinctively, if not completely by heart, and then go from there. And I think it sets you up for success. With the shuttle, you were on your back for almost 4 hours waiting to launch. So part of it was just, let's get this over with and get going. But then when the engine's light, you know you are going, and you know you're going somewhere pretty fast. And you go from, in the case of the shuttle, you go from 3 Gs to 0 Gs instantaneously, and things start floating. And I remember distinctly just thinking, what just happened? Because 8.5 minutes ago I was on Earth and now I'm in space. And obviously with Falcon 9 and Dragon, this will be the first time humans have ridden on the Falcon 9, even though it's flown many, many times. You tend to pull more Gs. The first stage is pretty similar. Like shuttle, we had about a 2.5 minute first stage. The difference is going to be with Falcon 9, the engines, you separate from that part of the rocket with the engines the first stage, and so you get kind of a weightlessness there for, or a lack of acceleration there for a split second or two. So that part of it is going to be distinctly different. We could experience somewhere on the order of 4+ Gs, whereas shuttle, we were limited to just 3 Gs. I think our concentration has mostly been on the profile, the crew vehicle interface, just how the Dragon will work for crews going forward. That's why we're going to do this flight now, is to prove out what we think it will do. Ideally, it will do exactly what we expect it to do. The first simulator where we integrated the Hawthorne mission control team and the Houston mission control team was a huge moment, to be able to just have the entire integrated team that's going to support us getting to and from space station, talking together, working through the challenges. I think that was probably for me the first big highlight, and that wasn't that long ago. It overwhelms you to think about how many people have in some way, shape, or form touched this program and this vehicle to get us to this point. We obviously in a lot of ways are the lucky ones that get to fly it, but we certainly not for 1 second take for granted the amount of effort that so many other people had to put into this to make it successful. And we'll do our part to make it successful and to get back here and celebrate with everybody in a few short months. Very excited. Yeah, very excited.
So today is as much about Bob and Doug and the future of the space program as it is a bit of an elegiac look back at the phase we just left behind. And that phase ended with the final flight of Atlantis. Let's take a look at Atlantis and how it got prepared for that final flight that ended the 135-flight space shuttle program. The spacecraft hatch has now been officially closed. We will get back to that Atlantis footage in a moment. You can see the White Room team sealing the hatch. It is a very painstaking process. This is the doorway that separates the astronauts from the void once they get to space, so you want no mistakes with this. Hatches have a long history in NASA. They have a very dark history with a hatch that would not open during the Apollo 1 fire. And so if there's any part of the spacecraft that has gotten special attention since that tragedy in 1967, it is the hatch, the doorway that separates the astronauts from their internal world to the external world. This crew, this White Room crew, will not leave this spacecraft until they are absolutely assured that the hatch is sealed and closed and that it is crew-worthy and flight-worthy. And it's starting to look as if they are satisfied with these preparations and will momentarily be backing away and allowing that swing arm to move back. And now let's take a look at that look at the final flight of the shuttle Atlantis and how it got ready for that closeout voyage. The final mission for America's space shuttle fleet began with the shuttle Atlantis in this processing hangar. The ship was there for weeks to check and recheck its millions of parts, making sure the very last shuttle was ready to haul 14 tons of food, equipment, and supplies to the International Space Station. Once Atlantis was announced fit to fly, the next step in this final trip was the procedure known as rollover. That began with Atlantis being towed from its processing hangar to the vehicle assembly building, following a path well worn by 134 other shuttle missions over 30 years of flying. 3 photographers documented this process with time-lapse pictures shot over the course of 4 days. In all, 15 cameras captured 120,000 images. Once inside the vehicle assembly building, the country's largest building by volume east of the Mississippi, Atlantis was lifted by a halter crane. It was then attached to its giant solid fuel boosters and to its 15-story liquid fuel tank. When that was completed, the shuttle emerged to begin its 6-hour slow crawl to the launch pad. Shuttle workers gathered by the hundreds to witness the space shuttle's final rollout, and with good and sentimental reason. 355 humans flew over the course of 135 shuttle missions from 1981 through 2011. The shuttle's secret was in some ways its very lack of glamour. It was a reusable workhorse ship that got humans and equipment to and from space, and in so doing helped ensure America's future off the planet. This launch of 2 astronauts aboard a SpaceX rocket, the first such launch from American soil since Atlantis' flight, is the next big step in that future. Once again, we are getting a look at the swing arm that will soon be pulling away from the spacecraft, leaving Bob and Doug there alone at the top of the rocket with their support team finally separated from them. You can see here that there's a bit of a rain squall. It's a little bit hard to make out the rainfall itself, but it's not at all hard to make out the gray skies, so there could be a few problems there. As you can see, we're back in the White Room now, and this hatch is getting still more attention, although it's looking like these touchpads are being used to check off those final milestones, and it looks like this crew is getting ready to leave the White Room at long last and let that swing arm come back. While we're waiting for the swing arm to come back, a big part of the future of the space program obviously does involve Elon Musk, and I had an opportunity to talk to him sometime last year. Let's see a little bit of that conversation we had at the SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California.
I think Apollo 11 landing on the moon was probably the most inspiring thing in history. Arguably the most inspiring thing. Just the level of inspiration that provided to the people of Earth was incredible. And it certainly inspired me. I kept expecting that we would continue beyond Apollo 11, that we would have a base on the moon, that we would be sending people to Mars. But the United States has been without the ability to send people to low Earth orbit since 2011 when the shuttle retired. We need to advance space beyond what has been done before, and that we need to send people to Mars. Expand our horizons, to do more.
In 2002, Elon Musk founded SpaceX.
We have liftoff.
Have liftoff.
Breaking the stranglehold that governments had had as the exclusive providers for access to space.
Second stage ignition confirmed.
When Musk couldn't lease facilities to launch his rockets from the continental United States, he moved a team of engineers to a small atoll in the Marshall Islands. Despite early failures, SpaceX eventually found success. In 2010, it became the first non-governmental organization to launch, orbit, and successfully recover a spacecraft. And in 2011, it was awarded its first NASA contract as part of the Commercial Crew program.
I thought starting SpaceX would be 90% likely to fail. The cost of access to space was just too high. Even if we doubled NASA's budget, unless NASA had good options for rocket contractors, they would still not make progress. So I actually just funded the whole company in the beginning myself, not because I thought it would turn out well, but because I thought it would fail.
Elon Musk's sheer brazenness, his willingness to break old molds and make bold promises, has captivated space fans, giving the company and its founders something of the popular following once enjoyed by Steve Jobs and Apple. And it's not just image. The company does things differently, relanding spent first stages on ocean barges, building its massive stainless steel Starship rocket, adding technological prowess to its popular sizzle.
The holy grail of access to space is a fully reusable orbital rocket. We cannot have a base on the moon. We cannot have a city on Mars. We cannot become a multi-planet species without full and rapid reusability. And we've made significant progress towards reusability with the reuse of the Falcon 9 boost stage. That's somewhere around 2/3 of the cost of launch, maybe 70%. And we've just recently been successful in catching the fairing, the nose cone of the rocket. And that is a crazy exercise with a boat that's basically a giant catcher's mitt. And the boat adjusts course automatically, and the two just, maneuver to touch each other.
While SpaceX is pushing the limits of rocket technology, it has also had some setbacks. A Crew Dragon spacecraft exploded during a test in 2019. The upcoming launch of a crew to the International Space Station is years behind schedule.
Any new development process, especially for something as complicated as a spaceship, that can safely fly crew, the importance focus for NASA is doing it safely, doing it right. You learn many times the most from the failures and the tests that don't go the way that you expect them to. So the incident with the Crew Dragon last year, testing the escape system on the ground, having an anomaly, and then going back and looking through the design, making sure that we fully understood everything that happened and really, upgraded the design to make sure that something like that could never happen again and be as safe as possible from beginning to end. And it really culminated in that successful in-flight abort test earlier this year.
And there you just saw the trunk jettison again, some really loud cheers.
But the Falcon 9 that will launch this week is now considered a reliable machine with a proven record. That does not say there's no risk. The rocket will use the so-called load and go approach before launch, with the fuel tanks being filled after the astronauts have boarded the spacecraft. This improves rocket performance given the dense, supercooled fuel that's used, but it's never been tried before with astronauts aboard, and there will be some tense moments leading up to the launch.
The NASA team really took, a strong look at all of the pros and cons of all the different ways to do that timing between crew, integration and ingress, and vehicle loading and launch. And they really came together and determined that this was the right, best approach to go do for this vehicle.
SpaceX represents a big part of NASA's future, but it also has a lyrical link to the past. One of the sweetest spots in all the world for people who love space is pad 39A.
It's the best pad.
Best pad. I mean, Apollo 11 left from there.
Yeah.
Virtually all of the lunar landing and orbital missions left from there. And now,
I can't believe we get to use this pad.
And that's my question.
An insane honor.
What does that feel like? That is SpaceX's leased pad now.
We're not worthy.
While this launch will be historic, Musk has his eyes on the future too, already building a new rocket dubbed Starship, capable of taking humans to the moon and even Mars. This flight marks an important first step toward those grander journeys to come. We're getting a live shot here of the scene at Cape Canaveral, and if you are not seeing the launch pad clearly, that's because the weather conditions have conspired once again against this launch. Now we are still 2 hours out from launch, close to 2 hours, 1 minute, 58 and 14 seconds, and Florida weather can be fickle stuff. It could clear and cloud up and clear and cloud up again couple of times in the next 2 hours, but at the moment these are not conditions in which any prudent flight director would launch a spacecraft. What we're hearing from Times reporters on the ground is the word torrential to describe the downpour. So at the moment, so far there's no launch, there's no countdown hold. There can't be a countdown hold today because there is an instantaneous launch window at 3:22. So the clock will keep running, and the spacecraft, the rocket, either will or will not get off the ground at 3:22 p.m. At the moment, if this weather holds, it will not get off the pad. But once again, we rely on the very volatility and fickleness of Florida weather to perhaps clear up for us. In the meantime, that is the very short-term future of space exploration, what's going to happen in the next 2 hours. Let's take a look at something of the longer view, what the future of space exploration is going to look like after this flight does get off the ground at some point in the next, over the course of the next couple of years and decades. Even as NASA and the rest of the world await this week's launch of 2 astronauts to the International Space Station aboard a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket, the space agency itself has its eyes trained deeper into space, much deeper. The entire purpose of the Commercial Crew program was not just to open up space travel to the private sector, it was also to allow the agency to devote its human exploration energy to returning astronauts to the surface of the moon, and later, to Mars.
We're going to Mars, and in order to go to Mars, we have to use the moon as a proving ground. We need to get to Mars. That's our driving ambition as an agency and as humanity. As far as exploration, this has been on the minds of many people for generations and generations.
The new lunar program, named Artemis, after the sister of Apollo, aims to have the first woman and the next man on the surface of the moon no later than 2024. The plan is an ambitious one, but with a lot of work and a few breaks, the goal can be met. Long in development and now nearing completion is the rocket that will be used for the missions. NASA's prosaically named Space Launch System, or SLS, the 21st century's answer to the 20th century's Saturn V. Initial versions of the SLS will stand taller than a 32-story building. Later iterations will top out at 38 stories. Either one will be more than capable of setting crews off on a deep space journey.
The SLS rocket, the biggest rocket that's ever been built in history, taller than the Statue of Liberty. It's on the 5-yard line, and we're going to punch it into the end zone. If we're going to land in 2024, which we're going to do, the key is going to be SLS.
Also nearly ready for flight is the Orion Crew Vehicle, an exceedingly souped-up version of the old Apollo spacecraft, able to carry as many as 6 crew members compared to Apollo's 3. The first flight could take place as soon as 2021.
Welcome inside the Orion trainer. Right now, I'd say crew members are over here 2 or 3 days out of the week doing different tests.
One of the neatest things about the Orion spacecraft in general is that this is designed to take us to Mars. And so this spacecraft is designed to be operated autonomously by the crew. So when we are on our way out to Mars, there's going to be minutes of comm delay back to Houston. And we have to make all the decisions in here. It's really amazing. It's an impressive vehicle.
In order to land on the moon, NASA needs a new lunar lander, and on April 30th, the space agency selected 3 companies, SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Dynetics, to begin the work of developing one. The early blueprints from all of the companies are promising, and the competition will be bracing, with only one company emerging as the final builder. NASA's goal for this generation of lunar landings is not to repeat the short visits of the Apollo missions, the so-called flags and footprints model, but rather to go to the moon to stay.
I don't want to give any specific dates. I don't want to make any announcements, but if we're going to land in 2024, we've got to select quickly. The goal is to lead a coalition of nations to have a sustainable presence at the moon with more access to more parts of the moon than ever before. We learned that there's hundreds of millions of tons of water ice at the south pole of the moon. What does that mean? Water ice represents air to breathe. It represents water to drink. It represents rocket fuel. We are going to Mars. The moon is a waypoint. It's the place where we learn how to live and work. We learn how to make it sustainable.
Only by learning how to live off the land in a long-term encampment just a 3-day flight from home can America be sure it's ready to take the next great step to send astronauts to Mars. After half a century of staying close to home in low Earth orbit, human beings will once again look deeper into space and will follow to the places that cosmic gaze leads them. Well, as you can see from this shot, the weather has only deteriorated further. There is no word yet from NASA on whether this flight would scrub early if the weather conditions seemed absolutely hopeless, or whether they will continue counting down straight to that 3:22 p.m. mark. One of the determining factors will be the load and go fuel. They have not yet begun fueling this rocket. That's a complicated process. It's entirely possible that if the weather continues to deteriorate, they'll decide it's not worth even going through that, and the launch would get scrubbed early and the crew would emerge early. But the betting here and the betting in Canaveral at the moment is no matter what, we will go right up to that 3:22 p.m. mark, and the spacecraft either will or will not lift off. Whatever happens today on the launch pad, what happened before the crew got to the launch pad is part of a long history of spaceflight traditions. Astronauts are not necessarily superstitious by nature, but they are creatures of habit. The first big moment in any astronaut's day has always been the pre-flight breakfast, typically steak and eggs. That was Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins having their pre-flight breakfast pre-Apollo 11. What we saw a moment ago was the traditional tree planting at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, where each new astronaut who goes aloft will plant a tree. The plush toy we saw floating in the spacecraft a moment earlier is another tradition. Astronauts will often bring along a toy of some kind, not simply as a comfort object, but so they have something that will float when they reach 0G. Remember, they're strapped into their seats. They can't float out. So when you see the plush toy beginning to fly, you know that you are in orbit. Here we see Bob and Doug continuing with their other tradition, the new tradition of signing the walls of the White Room before they take off. And one of the oldest traditions, and perhaps one of the least dignified of the traditions, is one begun by Yuri Gagarin, the first human being in space. On his way to the launch pad, he realized that he must have consumed a little bit too much coffee on his way to the pad, so he stepped out of the van and opened his spacesuit and relieved himself against the tire of the van, taking him to the launch pad. Ever since then, astronauts and cosmonauts leaving from the Baikonur Cosmodrome will stop on their way to the pad and have a similar self-relieving ceremony. It's not the most dignified, but it is one of the most enduring of spaceflight traditions. I am being told that we have one small error to correct here. Bob and Doug signing the wall of the White Room is not a new tradition. This, in fact, has been going on for decades of flights, including the Space Shuttle and other crews before them. This is simply the continuation of a long-standing tradition, this time, though, in a brand new White Room with a brand new spacecraft. Pad 39A, the launch pad from which the astronauts will leave for space today, if the weather permits, is one of the most historic spots in the history of the space program. Elon Musk, as you saw earlier, sees it almost as hallowed ground, as do a lot of people. It is the launch pad from which virtually all of the Apollo lunar missions flew, as well as all 135 of the shuttle missions. Let's take a look at the history of Pad 39A and how it came to be.
We're go, same type, we're go. Altitude, velocity, light.
Why, some say the moon. Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy, get down, Eagle.
Start. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. All three engines up and burning. 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. The final liftoff of Atlantis on the shoulders of the space shuttle. America will continue the dream.
Roger, roll, Atlantis.
Let's take a look back at some of the history that came before today. The Great Apollo program, of course, was the one that took human beings to the moon. There were 11 Apollo launches from Apollo 7 to Apollo 17, and 9 of them went to the lunar surface, or went to at least around the moon and then on to the lunar surface. Some of the great men and women of space history worked in that room. Gene Kranz, Glyn Lunny, Chris Kraft, all of the giants of the space program. The rockets that launched from Pad 39A during the Apollo program were the largest rockets ever built. If you had been able to harness the power of that rocket taking off, it would have been the equivalent of running every river in America through a single hydroelectric turbine at the same moment. That was the kind of energy that was used to get these rockets off the ground and into deep space. The technology used was, of course, primitive by today's standards. This was slide rule technology, this was pencil technology, this was mental math technology, and yet it got these spacecraft to the lunar surface. The touchdown on the moon that was achieved here on Apollo 11 on July 20th, 1969, was the culmination of a promise President Kennedy made 8 years earlier, when he simply declared that we choose to go to the moon. We don't have to go to the moon. We choose to do this because we are a spacefaring people. We are a questing people. We are people who look at what's on one mountain and decide we have to get to the other mountain. We are people who look at one coast of an ocean and decide we have to get to the other side of that ocean in order to explore. It all began with these 7 men, the original Mercury astronauts. 6 of the 7 flew. 1 didn't because of an early heart murmur. What they went through to be qualified was not easy stuff. From the Mercury program, the one-man spacecraft, the very first launch was right here. You see it on a Redstone rocket. It was a little popgun suborbital flight. It's a tiny rocket. This spacecraft carrying Alan Shepard did not go into orbit. It went into what was called a suborbital flight. He had about 5 minutes above the atmosphere, about 5 minutes of weightlessness, but that was enough for America to have said it had put men in space, or it had put a man in space. There was a second suborbital flown by Gus Grissom shortly after Al Shepard's flight. The crowds that gathered to watch these launches were a sign of what this meant to the United States. This wasn't just a technological achievement. This was a geopolitical achievement. This was the United States in a bipolar world with the post-war capitalist American system on one end and the communist system on the other, and it was very much seen as a war of two ideologies. This, what we're looking at here, was views of John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth on February 20th, 1962. The one-man Mercury program led to the two-man Gemini program. This was the program that allowed astronauts to test the technologies they would need to get to the moon: rendezvous, docking, spacewalks, long-duration space flights. The Gemini 7 crew, Jim Lovell and Frank Borman, spent 2 weeks sealed in a Gemini spacecraft. Right here, what we're looking at is the rendezvous between the Gemini 6 and Gemini 7 spacecraft. The very first time two spacecraft met in orbit. That was considered an almost impossible feat to achieve. Spacewalking in its early iterations was not a safe thing to do. If we are looking at Gene Cernan here, and it's hard to tell, this was could be the Gemini 9 spacewalk, in which Gene Cernan labeled the spacewalk from hell. He overheated. He could not see in his spacesuit. His helmet visor clouded up. But it was one way of learning what spacewalking involved, and that it wasn't simply the happy drift that people thought it was. Going forward, of course, beginning in 1981, was the shuttle program. This was the point at which the U.S. decided that we were going to make a long-term commitment to low Earth orbit, which sounded less swashbuckling than the space shuttle or than the Apollo programs, but this was our chance to live in space. This was the space shuttle was equal parts elegant and wonderfully simple. It was a space truck. It ran, as it said, shuttle runs to and from Earth orbit to bring crews up, to bring hardware up. It launched some of the greatest spacecraft in history. The Galileo probe that orbited Jupiter left from the body of a space shuttle. The Hubble Space Telescope left from the body of a space shuttle. 135 such missions made spaceflight routine. Since the grounding of the space shuttle, we have been a nation that has flown to space with the aid of the Russians aboard the Russian Soyuz spacecraft. The Soyuz has been flying since 1966. It's sort of the Volkswagen Beetle of the space program. It's tough, it's reliable, it's all but indestructible. It is a speedy cosmic sports car, and it's a heck of a machine going up and a heck of a ride coming down. Scott Kelly, who spent a year in space, said that landing in a Soyuz spacecraft is a little bit like going over Niagara Falls in a barrel that's on fire. And yet, here we see Christina Koch coming back from space after having spent nearly a year in space. What we are looking at here appears to be an early iteration of the constellation, the Ares 5. This is a simulation of the what was going to be America's return to the moon program. It was begun in 2004 by the George W. Bush administration, and the goal was to have human boots back on the moon as early as 2015. It was going to consist of two boosters, one that was a relatively small booster, the Ares 1, to take astronauts to space, and another, the Ares 5, which would take cargo, rather. This was a launch of the Ares 1, the very first iteration of the very first of the constellation programs. And here again are simulations of what the lunar vehicle would have been. The Constellation program fell victim, unfortunately, to what often happens in Washington, which is that as administrations change, so too do goals. The Constellation program had gotten rather far along when the Bush administration transitioned to the Obama administration, and the Obama administration then decided to focus less on a return to the moon and more to the commercial crew program with the commercial sector, the Boeing Starliner and the SpaceX Dragon, taking over the work of getting astronauts to and from low Earth orbit so that the space agency, the space program, so that NASA could focus on deep space exploration. And this is where we stand now, with the commercial crew program taking care of low Earth orbit, and NASA looking forward to returning to the moon with both the Artemis program and the new lunar lander being developed for the Artemis program. 3 companies have now been chosen to build that lunar lander. Blue Origin, which is the company owned by Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, SpaceX, and Dianetics, and all 3 of them are working on building a lunar lander. Meantime, what we're looking at here is the new Shepard rocket that Blue Origin hopes to use to send paying customers into suborbital space, very much like Alan Shepard's very first flight into space. Here we're seeing the Virgin Galactic spacecraft. Similarly, Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic company hopes to launch paying customers on suborbital flights that will give them about 5 minutes of weightlessness above the atmosphere. Ultimately, Elon Musk, in what the images we're seeing here, hopes to launch his 150-foot tall stainless steel Starship rocket on the surface of the moon. This looks improbable, but NASA believes enough in this that this is one of SpaceX is one of the companies that's gotten a contract to help develop a lunar lander. This is Musk's next great enterprise, and Starship is where he hopes to make his mark, landing both on the surface of the moon and ultimately on Mars. We're back now to a live picture of the pad, and it looks like things may have cleared up a little bit. We will see what NASA has to tell us about where the weather stands, but the sky looks a bit bluer, the rain looks a bit subdued, and there is still a chance that we could be getting off the ground today at 3:22 p.m. We are, like the rest of the world, watching this this impending liftoff today, waiting for what NASA reports will be a weather update. Weather will be the final determinant. As we can see from this angle, it does appear that the skies are clearing. Now, those are some pretty formidable clouds through which the spacecraft would have to launch, but those are some pretty promising blue patches among the clouds. And the better news is the air appears generally clearer, generally less cloudy, less foggy, and generally less rainy. So we are standing by for a weather update from NASA, which we are told will be coming momentarily. So we are here with Terry Virts, the veteran of 2 space flights, 2 weeks aboard one space shuttle mission helping to build the International Space Station, and then 200 days aboard the space station involving 3 spacewalks, 1 stint as commander of the station, a trip you made by Soyuz, the Russian Soyuz rocket. So you're a veteran of 2 very different kind of spacecraft. The space shuttle, which is just a big bruiser of a machine, and sort of a sports car like the Soyuz. What do you think it would be like to fly the Crew Dragon?
Well, I think it's going to be a lot more like the Soyuz. It's roughly the same size. I noticed when I flew on the space shuttle, it was like a muscle car. It was rumbling and lots of noise, and it kind of slowly takes its time getting into space. It's similar to a Saturn V in terms of weight and thrust, whereas the Soyuz was bam, and you're just up and gone. Of course, it was a nuclear ICBM, a Soviet ICBM. So they didn't want those things to sit around and look pretty. They wanted them to get going quickly. Right. So the Falcon is going to be a lot more like the Soyuz.
All credit to them if this launch goes off, as we hope it will. But they are several years behind schedule, and the U.S. has been 9 years now without the ability to get astronauts to space on our own spacecraft. We're used to thinking of going to low Earth orbit as fairly routine. Why has it taken so long? Why is it so hard to get spacecraft into orbit?
Well, the easy answer is space is hard and it takes time, and you have to work on all the technical things. But the reality is, between John Glenn's or Alan Shepard's first flight and Neil and Buzz on the moon, that was 8.5 years. And people, there were no cell phones to help do email, and we didn't have any history. So we were quicker in the 60s than we are today. And this is SpaceX, which is probably one of the fastest rocket companies ever. I mean, they get stuff done quickly.
Right.
Part of the problem happened where Congress just underfunded the program, right. Which takes some of the air out of this is a privately funded thing, because it was really a government funded project. And right. When the government didn't fund it by the full amount, that really slowed it down. Part of it is, there are problems that happened, and there's been several, serious technical problems along the way. But when I was in space, the SpaceX cargo capsule showed up a couple of times and brought my underwear and food and supplies. And that program happened really, really quickly. It was basically, I think, 2008 when the cargo contract was really going, and by 2012 they were delivering stuff to the space station. So SpaceX has shown it can get stuff done much more quickly than the old government model, but it's still not a perfect system, and it's still taking us longer in the 2010s than it did in the 1960s.
There's another competitor in this race, of course, Boeing, and Boeing's spacecraft is its CST-100 Starliner, which also will be carrying astronauts to and from the International Space Station. Now, they had a bit of a setback on their last uncrewed mission. They weren't quite able to reach the International Space Station. What do you think about Boeing's chances for getting their own crews up there, and how quickly do you think they'll be able to be flying?
Well, I think Boeing is going to do this also. It's going to take them, they're many months away. This is not going to happen next month for Boeing. It's going to take some time before they do it. They had software problems. And when I was a test pilot, I mostly worked on software programs, and I would always tease the engineers, it's only software, guys. Come on, you should be able to get this done. And the reality is software is often the hardest, longest, most complicated, part of any aerospace program. But I'll ask you this question, Jeff. Do you want to check your MySpace account later on today? The reality is, MySpace was the first to market, right. But now everybody does Facebook, right? So just the fact that you're the first to market is sometimes good, and sometimes it's irrelevant. So right. Boeing is definitely a player in this market, if you will. Mm-hmm. The ISS program is a pretty small market. It's only 1 or 2 launches a year for each company. It's really not a big program. So the real marketplace is going to be, if we ever get to a place where there's private space stations like the Bigelow space station, or
right.
if we ever start legitimately manufacturing in space, then companies like SpaceX and Boeing, and maybe others eventually, Sierra Nevada or who knows,
Right.
then they'll be launching 4, 5, 10 capsules a year, and not just one a year, and then it becomes interesting. So the government is kind of seeding that market, but hopefully it will eventually grow into something bigger.
And if it grows into something bigger, if we do have private space stations in orbit being serviced by private spacecraft, will they be vacation? Will they be academic? Will they be industrial? Will they be all of the above?
I think the space station has a corner on the academic market. You know, it's a government subsidized thing. That's the place for universities or companies to do research. The space station is the place for science projects, but it's not a place for manufacturing. Right. So if we ever figure out how to do 3D printing of human organs, or make microelectronics and mass scale that you can make them better in weightlessness than you can on Earth, if any of those technologies actually hit, then that's going to have to go to the Bigelow or, you know, another private space. So that's one of the markets, is manufacturing. And I think the tourism is also a very interesting idea. There's several, you know, space tourist companies, if you will. Virgin and Blue Origin are probably going to fly tourists first, maybe this year, maybe next year, but those are just suborbital. They go up and come down 5 minutes later.
That's right.
To have orbital space tourism would be amazing, but that's going to require a place like the ISS that's not exactly set up for tourists. It's a government thing. So I think that would be a really interesting marketplace. Of course, it's going to be probably more expensive than a retired astronaut or a journalist would be able to afford.
Yeah, I have a feeling I'll just be looking at someone else's vacation photos.
They're family movies.
Exactly. Elon Musk is a character. I think even Musk himself would admit that he's a bit of a character. And there's been some friction between him and NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine in the last year or so. Are you troubled by that, or do you just see it as sort of the rough and tumble of the space business?
I'm not troubled. I thought you were going to say there's been some friction between him and everyone.
A little of that.
This is the world that we live in. I'm a lot more troubled or excited by a rocket that works or doesn't work than I am about, you know, some tweets going off. Elon has admitted that he's the kind of the king of self-inflicted wounds. If I was a shareholder, I might want my CEO to, you know, be more focused on shareholder value and not on, you know, Twitter. But that's between him and his shareholders. So the things that concern me as an astronaut, if I were flying, and I'm not, I'm retired, I don't work at NASA, I'm done. Is the rocket going to work? Is the escape engine going to work? Will the parachutes work? Will the rendezvous system work? Is the software are the computers going to work? All that's the stuff that really would concern me. And that's where I think having some transparency and making sure that you're just being open and honest with the public is more important. Some of this other stuff is just showmanship, I think.
Right. Now, before we went live here, you and I were talking a little bit about the difference between flying, say, a Soyuz and flying the new SpaceX Crew Dragon. And certainly no slur on Bob Behnken or Doug Hurley, the astronauts who will be aboard the Crew Dragon. But you said that there is a bit less flying going on with this spacecraft than there is when you're at the stick of a Soyuz or a space shuttle. Tell me a bit about that. How come?
Right. So actually, the details of it are proprietary, and I've never worked at SpaceX, or that wasn't my job back when I was at NASA. So I don't know all the details, but from what I understand, there's basically no flying involved. Everything is automated from the launch to on-orbit maneuvering. The docking is automated. During entry, there's nothing for the crew to do. The capsule does everything. There's not, from what I understand, there's not even like a control stick that you normally have to fly an airplane or a spaceship. They are going to do some manual maneuvering during docking. just to prove that the system works, because this is a test flight. So, but it's like it's a touchpad. So they're going to have a screen, and they'll be, roll left, and then the shuttle will roll left, and then pitch up, and the capsule will pitch up. Flying on the space shuttle, was designed in the 70s. It was the best flying machine of all time. It was, and you could fly it, during launch. I did fly it in orbit. I flew, rendezvous, and I flew around the space station with the control stick, and back in the atmosphere, I flew it with the control stick, and like an airplane. So the shuttle, from a test pilot's point of view, there will never be anything as cool as the space shuttle, because you could really fly the thing. But this is a new era. It's the 2020s. And, we're going to have self-driving cars. I think by the end of the century, our grandkids are going to think back and, hey, Grandpa, what was it like to have a car that you had to drive, This is just the way of things. The goal of this is not to fly it. The goal of this is to take people from Earth to the space station and back. It's just a logistical cog in the space station program. As you mentioned, we've been doing this since John Glenn and Yuri Gagarin in the early 60s. And this is just a more modern version of that. And this is not the goal. Like I said, we got to get people into space. The goal is what they do after they get to space. That's the interesting part of it. So this is kind of it's the rental car at the airport. It's not your vacation destination.
We're talking about 2024 to have boots on the moon, the first woman and the next man. In candor, are you sanguine about that? Do you think we can make that date?
Well, the Commercial Crew Program, if you will, was really born in 2009 when the Obama administration took over, and Charlie and Laurie Garver kind of ran the space agency. They announced Constellation was canceled the week I launched in space in 2010. And here it is, 2020. So that's a decade. Yeah. And we still haven't sent people just to Earth orbit in a capsule. Right. And we're going to be on the moon in 4 years. So I just, as a realistic person, that doesn't seem realistic at all. However, in the 60s, we did do that, right? We were able to make it happen. Yeah. But it's not the 1960s NASA today. So that's going to be something that's going to be very difficult. I think we also need to say, why are we doing that? And I think if it's part of a strategic plan to use the moon as a testing ground to get to Mars, if it were part of a truly strategic plan, then you do the things you need to do to, fulfill that strategic plan, rather than just say, here's a random thing and we have to do it. The other thing is the debt that we're racking up right now, Jeff, is staggering, and it's just changed the course of the next decade or two, what's happening in 2020. So we're going to have to be very strategic about money that we spend. Right. So I think there's just a new reality that we're in.
Right. And that brings us to the always somewhat touchy area of politics. For our viewers, you mentioned Constellation, which was, of course, the lunar exploration program that was established under the George W. Bush administration, and there was a fair amount of progress, a good amount of progress that was made on that. And then it was canceled under the Obama administration, and the Obama administration had a number of its own policies, including the asteroid redirect mission, moving an asteroid closer to Earth, and then studying it. Now, under the Trump administration, we are back on a lunar course. Do you worry that whatever happens in November, the Trump administration will either end then or it will end in 4 years? That's not much time either way. Right. Do you worry that we will once again shift course and start all over and have a new program that will have to be begun from scratch? Right. One of the things, while I was an astronaut, you fly and then you go visit Congress and the White House. I've been there several times. And now that I'm retired from being an astronaut, I've spoken at the National Space Council to the Vice President. And I talk to folks often. And the one message I always have for them is, it's not about the rocket science, it's about the political science. And unless the way to run a space program is not
change what the last guy did because you don't like him. And that's what we've been doing now for more than a decade. So the political system's broken in so many ways. NASA is just 1% of a really messed up political system, right?
Right.
So I think the hope for me is that private companies can put together a plan. I think if we can figure out how to do private-public partnerships right, and I know Mr. Breinstein's been really focused on that, and that I know this is a priority for him, but let Blue Origin, just let them go. Let SpaceX go, let Sierra Nevada go, let these other companies, and Boeing and Lockheed, they can do things privately, and when they are allowed to do that, they can be more efficient too. So I think if we can figure out how to let these companies do things, and let the government do things like make treaties, bring in Russia, bring in Europe, bring in other countries to work. Eventually we're gonna need nuclear power. Government's gonna have to do that. SpaceX is not gonna make a nuclear reactor. So I think if we figure out how to do that right, that can help us moderate, attenuate some of this political ups and downs that we have. Because otherwise, it's never going to happen. And the SLS, that rocket really was born in 2005 when George W. gave his vision for space exploration.
Right.
It was going to use cheaper engines. It was going to be, they weren't going to have a capsule on it. It was going to just be the cargo ship. It was part of an integrated plan.
Yeah.
And then that got canceled and changed. And that was 15 years ago. And it's still years and years away from launching people. So.
Yeah, I remember at the time in 2005 when it was announced, the target date was footprints on the moon, maybe as early as 2015. Well, that's 5 years ago. We're still not back in low Earth orbit.
I think Air and Space Magazine did an article. I was one of the next astronauts on the moon. I was one of the guys they featured, along with some of the, I think Behnken and Karen Nyberg, actually.
Yeah.
Bob and Doug's wives, I think they were in there too.
Would you suit back up to go to the moon?
You know what? To go to the moon, yes, of course. I had this do I stay or leave calculus that I went through at NASA, and I had kind of done everything there was to do. I was the station commander and shuttle pilot and blah, blah, blah. So there was other things I want to do in life. But I always said if I could go make a film in space, that's something I would like to do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now there's talk of that happening. There's talk of Tom Cruise shooting aboard the International Space Station. So. So maybe you can co-star with Tom Cruise. Well, is there anything else that I have neglected to ask you that you think our viewers would want to know about what the stakes are this week and what it feels like to be Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley climbing into this machine?
I can say that when I flew on both of my flights, it was really exciting. The very first time I suited up for my first flight, it ended up being canceled for weather, and we launched again the next day. And that first time it was like I was out of my element. I was nervous. I was in this big suit. Even though I practiced it, it really was kind of, okay, this is something different. But the second night I went out, I felt a lot more comfortable, and it was almost like I'd already done it, even though I hadn't. So the nerves were better that second time. Bob and Doug aren't going to have that because they've both flown, they've flown several shuttle missions. It's been a decade since they've flown.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's going to be a problem. Also, on my first flight, my first 2 days were miserable. I had the worst headache of my life. I was taking ibuprofen, and it was on my third morning. I remember Steve Robinson said, "Hey, how are you feeling?" And I was like, "God, I feel like crap." And then literally a few minutes later, it was like a light switch, and all of a sudden I was fine. Yeah. And then I was fine the rest of the time. On my second flight, even though it was 4 or 5 years later, I felt fine. Like your body just needs a couple days to figure out what the heck just happened.
Right.
Your inner ear fluids and everything.
Yeah.
For some reason, your brain figures it out. And at least for my case, and I've heard others say the same thing, I felt okay. And so my guess is that they're going to feel okay because this isn't their first space flight.
Right. You told me something once, speaking about spacewalking, about what it's like to step out into that void, and every one of your rational brain cells tells you that you cannot fall. You are in orbit. Physics is keeping you up there.
Right.
But look down, and there's nothing below you but a planet 250 miles below you. Describe that experience a little bit.
So on my first spacewalk, when I went outside, it was nighttime on Earth, but the station was up in the sunlight.
Right.
So that actually helped, because when it's daytime on Earth, you see the Earth going by, and several of my colleagues had said, "Man, I got vertigo when I went outside." I didn't think I would, but I wasn't sure because it was my first time. So I went outside. The very first thing I did, there's a waist tether on the side. I pulled it off. I clipped it on a handrail, and I let go. So I was in outer space, floating above Earth, and I just looked down. I looked around. I went, "Okay, I'm fine." I just wanted to make my brain behave and make sure it was okay.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't like ledges. I hate standing on the edge of a building or something like that. I hate it. And so whenever I'm on a bridge or on a building, I always walk right over to the edge.
Yeah.
Just to force myself to do it, because I don't like it. It's almost like I'm just having to beat my brain into submission, and but I still feel, I'm like, ugh. Yeah. If I'm in a fighter jet flying upside down, I'm fine because I'm strapped in and it's okay. If I'm standing on a ledge. So that was it. That was my way to try and get my brain, like, as you so well described it, every rational brain cell knows you're okay, but it's the emotional brain cells that don't necessarily know that.
You've got a book coming out soon. Tell me a little bit about that.
I do. Well, we both do. But my next book is going to be called How to Astronaut. It's a collection of 51 short essays. The goal is to laugh and to say, wow. Those are the two things that I hope to get by it. I wrote it myself, no ghostwriters. And it's some basic stuff like, how do you learn how to be a doctor? How do you learn how to launch in a space shuttle? It's some crazy stuff like, what do you do if the engines don't light and you're stuck in orbit? Or what do you do with a dead body if your crewmate dies? Or are there aliens? And so it's some stuff that is expected, some stuff that's not expected. You can pick it up and read it. Any chapter, it doesn't have to go in order. It's just a collection of essays, and I think it's going to be pretty fun. It's a good beach read when you go to the beach this summer. Coming out September 15th, so they've started doing pre-sales now.
Terrific. Congratulations on that. And thank you very much for spending time with us, Terry Virts, veteran of 2 space flights and former commander of the ISS. Not bad.
Thanks, Jeff. Looking forward to this launch.
Thank you. So am I. And welcome back. For those of you who are just joining us, we are now T-minus 1 hour, 1 minute, and 40 seconds from launch. We are awaiting a weather update from NASA. At the moment, the skies look clear. It appears that the torrential downpours of earlier in the day have ended. The winds do not seem too challenging. So the hope is that we will see that swing arm, the access arm that connects the spacecraft to the gantry, move back soon. There will be at 2:25 in about 5 minutes an Air Force One flyover carrying the President and the First Lady, who will be here to watch the launch and later to make some comments in the vehicle assembly building. The Vice President, who was here yesterday, will not be here, or who was here on Wednesday rather, during the first attempted launch, will not be here today. President Trump will not be the first president to watch a launch live, though he will be one of the first. The only other two were President Nixon, who in November of 1969 watched the Apollo 12 crew launch for the second lunar landing, and much later in October of 1998, President Clinton watched John Glenn on his great return to flight. Here in this shot, we see former President Lyndon Johnson and then Vice President Spiro Agnew at the launch of Apollo 11, but President Nixon, who had been in office for just 6 months at that point, did not attend. He did, as you can see, attend the return of the crew. He was on board the USS Hornet when they were recovered. This, you can see here, President Clinton and First Lady Hillary Clinton, watching the launch of Senator Glenn, and here is President Michelle Obama visiting the space station or the Space Center earlier in the decade. Once again, here is rollout footage. And for those folks who are joining us on YouTube, here we have the presidential flyover, Air Force One bringing the president and the First Lady to the launch facility where they will watch the takeoff that we hope will be coming now in 58 minutes and 52 seconds. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube, there is a comment section in YouTube. We would love to answer any questions, respond to any comments you have. One question that came in from a viewer earlier was how long it will take the astronauts to get to space. And the remarkable thing is this is just a 12-minute ride from the surface of the Earth in a 1G gravity sphere, gravity well, to low Earth orbit in 0G. The astronauts, Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, will make that transition in just 12 minutes. Now, it will take them 19 more hours inside their spacecraft to catch up with the International Space Station, but only 12 minutes to go from Earth to orbit. It is a hot, fast sprint. Once those engines light, these guys are truly hauling the mail. The astronaut's day is a complicated one. We're looking at some scenes here from Wednesday when the launch was scrubbed. This is Bob Behnken, and that's Doug Hurley, and Bob Behnken being suited up in the same suit-up room that was used in the Apollo program, and some of that equipment, some of that off-green equipment on the back wall is the original hardware that was used back then. It's still being used now. It's relatively simple stuff. You can see those old analog meters. Once the crew is suited up, they are made ready to get to the launch pad. They are carrying, as you can see, the umbilicals here. They have air conditioning systems. Since these spacesuits are essentially self-contained spacecraft, they need their own kind of coolant system. We see here the two astronauts speaking to both Elon Musk and on the right, and Jim Bridenstine, the administrator of NASA, on the left. These are the two men who are most responsible for what will happen today. The walkout happened on Wednesday very nominally. This is how it's supposed to look. A lot of waves and blown kisses to friends and family. The backup crew is there with them as well. Typically, backup crews are there until the very last moment, always ready to be available in the event an astronaut would not fly. Here they were climbing into the Gull Wing Tesla, getting ready to go out to the launch pad, saying goodbye to their wives and children. Again, you notice they are standing behind a yellow line, and it's only pantomime hugging going on here. This was the case even before the COVID pandemic. Astronauts have always been put into some kind of pre-flight quarantine to keep them from carrying any pathogens up to the International Space Station, but particularly in the age of COVID, we do not want this new virus making it off the ground and into space. One correction from earlier, that was not today's Air Force One flyover that we showed you. That was footage from Wednesday. Apparently there will not be a flyover today. The President and the First Lady are coming in via Air Force One, but there won't be the same kind of flyover for the press and the spectators. The crew plugged in their environmental control systems from their spacesuits into a similar environmental system in the Tesla on the way out to the launch pad. We are told they listened to a mixtape on the way out that included the Blues Brothers, AC/DC, and the Star Spangled Banner to get them in the mood for this most American of missions, the first time American astronauts will be launching aboard an American rocket from American soil since July of 2011, when the shuttle Atlantis made the final trip to the into orbit to service the International Space Station. We are now at T-minus 51 minutes and 55 seconds, and we just got word from NASA that the escape system, the rockets that would pull the spacecraft away from an exploding Falcon 9 in the event of an emergency, are being armed, which is a good sign. That means they are preparing for launch. Much more important, the fueling that will take place about 30 minutes before launch. Loading on those 76,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and kerosene into the spacecraft, or into the rocket rather, are also on track to proceed on time. So these are both good signs. Again, we are still close to an hour away. Weather can do a lot of funky things in an hour, and we have no way of knowing with any certainty if this mission will get off on time. But those are two very promising signs that they are going ahead with these two very important milestones, arming the escape system and fueling the rocket in anticipation for launch.
get into the White Room, which was the last place we saw them standing up before they climbed inside Dragon. And again, the wider shot there of Launch Complex 39A, where we are inside of an hour from liftoff, and I think we're just a couple minutes away from the poll we're going to hear before they start propellant load. Again, a two-stage rocket there. And gosh, you guys, the weather looks not that bad. I mean, obviously that is not an official forecast, but it doesn't look quite as bad as it did Wednesday. We've got a little bit better odds. So there's the countdown clock. We're going to pause to listen to that comm.
We've gotten a number of questions from viewers about how we keep space coronavirus free. An important lesson was learned in 1968 when the Apollo 7 astronauts all caught head colds on a miserable 11-day mission. COVID is much more serious than a head cold, but protocols that were put in place back then are still in place today to keep any spacecraft disease-free. So let's take a look at how space is being kept COVID-free in this time of pandemic. There's no better way to escape the coronavirus that's stalking the world than to leave the world altogether. Astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley will be doing that when they take off aboard a Crew Dragon spacecraft for a flight to the International Space Station. But before leaving, they had to ensure they weren't carrying the virus aloft with them. That meant quarantine, or crew health stabilization, as NASA calls it. For decades, NASA astronauts have quarantined before traveling to space, but that's not the way it always was. In the early days of the Mercury and Gemini programs, the idea of isolating the one- and two-man crews before flight was considered ill-advised and even impossible. There was just too much work for them to do to indulge any worries about colds and flus. All of that changed after the flight of Apollo 7, when astronauts Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and Walt Cunningham came down with severe head colds early in what turned out to be a miserable 11 days in space. By the time of the Apollo 8 lunar orbit mission, a 21-day pre-flight quarantine protocol was put into place. The crew was scheduled to launch December 21st, 1968, which should have meant quarantining from December 1st on. But President Lyndon Johnson had other ideas, and on the evening of December 9th, he held a dinner at the White House honoring the crew and the rest of NASA. That meant a late start on quarantining, with the 21 days cut to just 12. For the first 3 of the 6 successful lunar landing missions, Apollos 11, 12, and 14, there was not only a pre-flight quarantine, but 3 more weeks of isolation afterwards to ensure that the astronauts were not carrying any lunar pathogens back with them. By the time of Apollos 15, 16, and 17, NASA, reassured that lunar pathogens didn't exist in the first place, lifted the post-flight part of the lockdown. The 3 crews that flew to Skylab, America's first space station in the 1970s, had a longer 3-week pre-flight quarantine period in keeping with the longer stretch they'd be spending in space. The shuttle crews got a break. Just a week of pre-flight quarantine, 3 days spent at crew quarters at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and 4 spent in similar accommodations at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. With the coronavirus at large, Behnken and Hurley were assigned a longer 12-day quarantine period, 5 days in home isolation and 7 at Cape Canaveral. They and the few technicians and medical personnel who have come into contact with them during quarantine were also required to have 2 negative coronavirus tests in order for the crew to be certified fit to fly. Where humans go, at least some germs hitch a ride with us. The key is to ensure as few as possible accompany us to space. And here we are at last seeing that swing arm moving away from the spacecraft. Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley are now very much on their own, with the exception, of course, of the tens of millions of people in the world watching their mission and the hundreds and even thousands of controllers on the ground around the country and around the world who are helping to keep them safe. So in that sense, they are not at all alone, but physically they are there without their support team, without their White Room crew. It's just 2 men in that spacecraft getting ready to take off. We are now at T-minus 39 minutes and just 7 seconds. We are awaiting a shot of the presidential motorcade. The president and the first lady departed the White House at 12:10 p.m. today and arrived at the shuttle landing facility at 2:25, just 20 minutes ago. So they will be moving over to the operational support building next, where they will be, from which they'll be viewing the flight. Meantime, the skies continue to clear. The weather continues to look as if it is going to cooperate, and it only needs to cooperate for another 38 minutes and 25 seconds, after which Florida is free to do what Florida does, which is for the weather to become turbulent again. We just need these skies, these conditions to hold for now under 40 minutes. And as we see this rocket and this spacecraft on the launch pad, it's worth mentioning again just how extraordinarily well designed and engineered the machines are. The Falcon 9 rocket itself stands 229 feet tall. It's fueled by 9 Merlin engines using RP-1 rocket fuel, which sounds pretty glamorous, except RP-1 rocket fuel is pretty much just high-intensity kerosene, and that's mixed with liquid oxygen as the oxidizer. Each of the 9 engines produces 125,000 pounds of thrust for an overall 1.125 million pounds. The Falcon 9 first flew on June 4th, 2010. It's been an operational vehicle for a decade now. This will be the 84th launch of a Falcon 9, and significantly one of the things that distinguishes the Falcon 9 from virtually every other, or actually every other expendable rocket that does fly, is that when its first stage is spent, it's not simply dumped in the ocean as a use once and throw away piece of hardware. Instead, the first stage lands on a barge near the Space Center, and there have been so far 44 successful such landings, and 31 of these first stages have been successfully refurbished and reflown. The Dragon spacecraft itself that the astronauts will be flying in is sort of, think of it as the Apollo-era spacecraft on steroids. It's about as wide as the Apollo was, about 13 feet wide, but it's twice the height at 26.7 feet tall. It has significantly more habitable space than the Apollo did, which carried 3 men and something close to moderate comfort and moderate discomfort. This spacecraft is capable of carrying a crew of up to 7 men and women, although there will only be 2, obviously, this time. There are 16 thrusters arrayed around the spacecraft that allow it to perform the delicate choreographic maneuvers it will need to perform in order to dock with the International Space Station, to reorient itself for reentry, and to do all of the other maneuvering that is necessary during space flight. There have been 22 launches of a Dragon spacecraft, the cargo version of a Dragon so far, and 21 visits to the International Space Station. It is almost all automatic. Obviously, the astronauts are highly trained in order to take over at any point. The instrument panels are all touch screens, very different from the mechanical toggle switches and dials of the old Apollo era. And the crew is perfectly capable, eminently capable of flying the spacecraft on their own if any of the automatic systems fail to work. When they come home, they will land under the power of 2 small drogue parachutes and 4 main chutes. The Dragon, like the first stage of the Falcon rocket, is reusable. This is all in an attempt to ensure that that prices can be kept down and assembly can be complete. And what we just saw here, what we're seeing here, is a test of the escape system that was conducted last year to prove that the Dragon could successfully separate from a rocket that was threatening to explode. So we're working with 2 reliable machines today, 2 machines that have a very proven track record. The one thing they have not done until today, we hope, is carry human beings, and we are inside of 33 minutes now until the point at which that important milestone may at last be crossed. The presidential motorcade is now approaching. We should be able to see that soon. The weather looks calm, as you can see from the inset image on the left. The sky is rather blue, and as you can see in the top right corner, that windsock, that orange windsock at the top of a light pole does not seem to be getting pushed by much wind at all. So we have what appear from these decidedly non-scientific measures here, clear skies and low winds, and this is what you would want to see. The president and the motorcade should be arriving momentarily around this bend that we can see in the image here. The president will view the launch. He will arrive just about 8 minutes before launch time at 3:25 for the, or rather at 3:17 for the 3:22 launch, and will then go to the vehicle assembly building at 5 p.m. to address NASA workers and a number of the people responsible for what we hope will be today's launch. You see the motorcade arriving now. This is part of a long tradition of presidents making sure that they are present either at launches or at recoveries in order. There's politics involved, certainly. There is nothing wrong with doing the touchdown dance when something momentous like this happens under your administration. But also all presidents, going back to President Eisenhower, who was the president who founded NASA, have known that space travel is as much about technology and exploration as it is about politics and funding. And it's important for presidents, for any administration, to be there, to wave the flag, to show the colors, to make it clear that they are behind this enterprise. Traveling in space is expensive. Traveling in space is dangerous. And it's important for presidents to show that they are in support of this program and that they are backing it. And President Trump is there very much today to enjoy what looks like it could be a successful launch, which is now just 29 minutes and 15 seconds away. And it appears as if fueling of the rocket has now begun. You can see some of that condensation from the liquid oxygen that is part of the fuel mix subliming out of the spacecraft. This is the first crewed launch that it uses what is known as the load and go process. Typically, the rocket is fully fueled, and only then does the crew climb aboard. That was considered a safer way to go. But with the design of the Falcon 9 rocket, the supercooled and highly condensed fuel cannot sit in the tanks too terribly long before it begins to lose its efficiency, at least its efficiency within the system as it's designed for the Falcon 9. And for that reason, the fuel is kept in the tanks for as short a time as possible. Consider this a little bit like when horses load into the gate in any horse race. Horses will not tolerate a gate very long, which means once they're there, the race is about to begin. Fuel in this rocket will not tolerate lying idle in a tank terribly long. That doesn't mean it's going to blow up. It just means it's going to lose some of its energy potential. And for that reason, once the fuel is in the rocket, it is going to go. The astronauts boarded so long ago, hours ago now, which is very much a part of the process. It takes a great deal of last-minute work to get environmental systems up, to get crew checklists gone through, to drill what the final maneuvers are going to be. Crews are very accustomed to spending time flat on their backs in their spacecraft. As Doug Hurley said in the earlier piece we saw in NASA, for his shuttle flights, he was accustomed to spending as much as 4 hours on his back. One thing about fueling, it's interesting to think, we think of rockets as great machines that happen to be filled then with fuel, much the way your car is, 95% the weight of the vehicle, and you add a few extra pounds when you fill your tank. A rocket is quite a different thing. A rocket is something like an egg, with the shell as the rocket itself actually the lightest part of the entire assembly. It's the fuel that weighs the most. A Saturn V rocket, unfueled, weighed about 1.5 million pounds. Fully fueled, it weighed 6.5 million pounds. So you had fuel weighing more than 3 times the weight of the rocket. Think of a rocket as an empty vessel that is a machine that is used to process the fuel that fills it. The load and go process is underway now. It should complete not long before launch. It does not take all that long to pump even 76,000 gallons of fuel into a 229-foot machine. So with this fueling coming, it means we are in the final stages, just 24 minutes and 40 seconds now away from launch. And we have a question from a viewer as to why the launch time is so precise, why we have what's called an instantaneous launch. You either launch at 3:22 or you don't launch at all. Why can't we push it 20 minutes? In fact, if you were launching into any old orbit with any old spacecraft, you could do that. It wouldn't make terribly much difference. But it's a very delicate ballet between the International Space Station, which is in a 51-degree orbit relative to the equator at 250 miles above Earth. It's a very delicate dance between that spacecraft and the Dragon, which will have to launch from 28 degrees, then quickly move to a 51-degree inclination, and then orbit the Earth 13 times in order to catch up with the space station, essentially to intersect the orbit. Think of it as a series of spirals. The Crew Dragon will launch, and it has to spiral out carefully until it reaches the space station's orbit. If you launch even a second or two too early or too late, you miss that intersection point. So basically, the Crew Dragon is aiming for where the space station will be 19 hours and a handful of minutes from right now. And you cannot miss that launch by more than a second or two. Otherwise, you will fall short of or fly wide of the space station. And it's worth reminding ourselves and it's worth reminding ourselves and our viewers one last time about what SpaceX had to do to get to this point. This is a momentous day for the for a private company launching astronauts, launching NASA astronauts, and they had to go through a great deal to ensure that their systems were reliable, that their hardware was reliable, and that they could get crews safely away from a rocket that was threatening to explode. The two great tests that they had to go through were the so-called pad abort test, when the spacecraft was on the launch pad and fired its escape engines to prove that it could get away from a rocket that was threatening to go awry. And later a launch abort test in which a Dragon crew vehicle was actually launched atop a Falcon 9 rocket, and the Falcon 9 rocket was deliberately destroyed. An instance before it was destroyed, the Dragon spacecraft was capable of firing its escape engines and taking the astronauts to safety in the event of any kind of such eventuality today. And here we're looking now at this pad abort test. This was a test. Those engines that took that spacecraft off the ground would be the ones that would pull it away from a faulty rocket should any kind of accident occur. It would separate from the service module and it would release its parachutes, and the astronauts would then descend safely into the ocean. This, of course, is one of the reasons also that Cape Canaveral is the place from which we launch. We launch east over the ocean, which means that any accidents with rockets will fall harmlessly into the ocean and not toward population centers. It's also the reason that Russia, which does not have the same access to the same kind of warm water coastline at a low latitude, launches from Baikonur, which is very much desert. Here it looks like we're looking at the launch abort test in which a Falcon 9 was launched and then deliberately destroyed. Let's see if that's indeed the footage we're watching. But this was one more test to prove that the spacecraft could get safely away from a rocket that was in distress. And yes, here we see the spacecraft separating. Under these circumstances, the onboard systems would have sensed that the rocket was in trouble. It would have gotten the astronauts away, and that explosion of the rocket would have happened far behind where the astronauts were. On earlier spacecraft, the Mercury and Apollo spacecraft, there were escape towers on the top of the spacecraft that would pull the spacecraft away from the rocket. On the Dragon, there are escape rockets at the base of the Dragon itself that push it away from a rocket in distress. Either way, it keeps the astronauts safe.
Stage 2 locks load started.
And we see to the left here a lot of dignitaries on the balcony of the OSB building watching as the launch is about to take place. There are astronauts here. There are military folks here. General John Raymond, the head of the newly launched Space Force, is here. This is in lieu of the much more crowded viewing stands that would typically be the place from which launches were watched, but for the COVID pandemic. Of course, looking at this balcony, we're not seeing a whole lot of people wearing face masks. We're not seeing a whole lot of people socially distancing. This coronavirus may not be the immediate news of today, but if this launch goes successfully, in 13 minutes and 14 seconds, ignition will have happened. 12 minutes afterwards, the astronauts will be in orbit, and then all of us will have to go back to our everyday lives, which include the coronavirus. This should not be meant to diminish the success of today, but it is a reminder that we are about to achieve, it looks like we're about to achieve, may achieve something extraordinary in a time of extraordinary problems. And the launch will be a pleasant break from that, but it's a reminder also that we must continue to take the virus seriously. And if you are just joining us, we are now inside of 11 minutes to launch, T-minus 10 minutes and 54 seconds. The rocket is fueled, as you can see from the vapor subliming off the side of the rocket. That is the liquid oxygen. That is the supercooled liquid oxygen. That is one of the two fuels that's used. Supercooled cryogenics, liquid oxygen actually adds weight to a rocket, not simply because of the weight of the fuel. It actually causes the humid Florida air to condense against the side of the rocket and form a thin ice shell. The Saturn V, in the time it would sit on the launch pad, used to gain about 1,200 pounds just in ice forming on the side of the rocket. There's probably a little bit of that happening on the Falcon 9 rocket today. The fueling is complete. The astronauts are in what is effectively the terminal countdown now, just awaiting ignition and awaiting for the precise moment when the International Space Station, orbiting 250 miles above at about 17,150 miles an hour, moves into precisely the right position for the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket to light its engines and begin what will be a 19-hour chase between the two astronauts in the Dragon and the station itself. That will culminate tomorrow morning, shortly before noon, in a docking at the station.
with you. Have an amazing flight and enjoy those views of our beautiful planet.
Thanks, Jay. It is absolutely our honor to be part of this huge effort to get the United States back in the launch business. We'll talk to you for more, but thank you.
Copy all. Thanks for those words. Flight and enjoy those views of our beautiful planet.
Starting TVC hydraulic press. Stage 1 and Stage 2 engine chill has started. Engine hydraulics at pressure.
And on the viewing stand, it's hard to see in the image we have, but President Trump and Vice President Pence are both there, along with NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. It's unclear if Elon Musk, head of SpaceX, is with them, but the President and Vice President are present. The First Lady is there as well, and Jim Bridenstine, a former congressman, appointed as NASA Administrator by President Trump in 2017, replacing previous Administrator Charlie Bolden. It is Administrator Bridenstine who has been charged now with the job of overseeing the Commercial Crew program, as well as the much more ambitious Artemis program, which is intended to land the first woman and the next man on the surface of the moon in 2024. But today their minds are less on the moon and more on this immediate launch, which is now inside of just 4 minutes away.
Vehicle tanks pressing or strong back retract. Wrong back retract has started. Stage 2, RP1 bleed. Stage 1, RP1 bleed. AFTS final setup started. MVAC igniter purges. Pogo bleed. Dragon has transitioned to terminal count and is on internal power. Stage 1, LOX load close out. Vehicle is transitioning to internal power. Stage 2, LOX load is closed out. Propellant fills are complete. Dragon is in auto idle.
Ground gas closeouts is starting.
Falcon 9 is in startup. Dragon is in countdown. FTS is armed for launch. Dragon, SpaceX, go for launch.
SpaceX Dragon, we're go for launch. Let's light this candle.
T-minus 30 seconds.
Stage 1 tanks pressing for flight.
T-minus 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA, go SpaceX, Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
Vehicle pitching downrange.
1 Alpha.
Copy, 1 Alpha.
Stage 1 propulsion is nominal.
Falcon, power and telemetry nominal.
M1D, throttle down.
Vehicle is supersonic.
M1D, throttle up.
Max Q.
1 Bravo.
Copy, 1 Bravo.
Start of MVAC engine chill. M1D, throttle down. Eco.
2 Alpha.
Falcon stage separation confirmed.
Copy, 2 Alpha.
MVAC ignition.
Acquisition of signal lofts.
Stage 2 propulsion is nominal.
Dragon SpaceX, nominal trajectory.
We have seen now
Signal Bermuda.
the
SpaceX Dragon, nominal trajectory.
We've seen separation of the first stage booster, which should now be on its way to recovery on the ocean barge for reuse. On the left, we're seeing a view inside the spacecraft. To the right, we're seeing, looking back toward the end of the spacecraft,
Stage 2 propulsion is still nominal.
the tail end of the spacecraft, as that second stage engine continues propelling the astronauts to space. They are in a much smaller and much lighter vehicle than they were when they left the ground. The first stage is now gone. What is happening now is all about increasing acceleration. The crew is going to feel a maximum of 3 Gs on this flight, which is not terrible to the average person. That would be quite a lot. The average 150-pound person would feel like he or she weighed 450 pounds, but these astronauts are accustomed to eating 8 and 9 Gs in a simulator. What we should be seeing on the right now is a scene from the first stage, which is descending from midway toward space back toward the ocean. That appears to be what we are seeing. To the left is the view that you would see if you were behind Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, looking toward the instrument panel and the windows in the front of the spacecraft. The first stage on the right is in something close to controlled free fall now. It will not reignite its engines for landing until it gets closer to the ground. But attitude control thrusters along the flank of the booster, keep it aligned and keep it
SpaceX nominal trajectory.
keep it moving steady. When you hear nominal trajectory, that is all good news. Nominal in this case means exactly as you want it to be. On the right, you can see the thrusters now beginning to fire on that first stage as it slowly descends toward Earth. It is falling at a speed at this point, of course, that would not allow it to survive reentry, but it will.
Stage 2 propulsion is still good.
It will reignite its engines. S2 propulsion, as they just said, that's stage 2 propulsion. That means the second stage.
SpaceX nominal trajectory.
That means the second stage of the rocket is still proceeding to fire.
Nominal trajectory.
Hey, John, not the PTZ.
Acquisition of signal, New Hampshire. Stage 2 FTS is saved.
And now we can see those first stage engines have reignited as the first stage descends toward its landing barge. It is just about to penetrate through the cloud tops, and landing on the barge should be less than a minute away, though it's a little hard to tell from this perspective. It all depends on the exact height of that cloud
Terminal
ceiling.
guidance.
And back throttle step.
Shannon.
Copy, Shannon.
And back throttle step. And back shutdown.
Dragon SpaceX nominal orbital insertion.
Launch escape system is disarmed.
Dragon copies. Nominal orbital insertion.
Those are some sweet words, nominal orbital insertion. The Dragon spacecraft is in orbit. Unfortunately, the signal, then we are seeing on the left that not only is the Dragon spacecraft in orbit, but the first stage of the rocket has successfully landed on
Acquisition of signal, Newfoundland.
has successfully landed on the barge that is playfully named, Of Course I Still Love You, welcoming the first stage back. The crew is in orbit. The first stage is recovered. The first launch from American soil in an American spacecraft with American astronauts since 2011 has now placed those astronauts in orbit.
Loss of signal, Wallops.
And at this point, what we are seeing is a surprisingly controlled mission control room
Dragon separation
in Hawthorne, California, where the flight controllers seem relatively calm given the enormity of what they've just accomplished. Separation of the lower stage of the second stage engine of the spacecraft is now complete. The Dragon is independently in
Dragon
orbit.
SpaceX, with that separation call, we have a few words for you from our Falcon 9 team.
Let's listen in on this.
Dragon, Chief Engineer on Dragon to Ground. Bob Doug, on behalf of the entire launch team, thanks for flying with Falcon 9 today. We hope you enjoyed the ride and wish you a great mission.
Congratulations to you and the F9 team for the first human ride for Falcon 9, and it was incredible. Appreciate all the hard work, and thanks for the great ride to space.
Copy all.
Oh, and Mike, proud of you guys and the rest of the team. Thank you so much for what you've done for us today, putting America back into low Earth orbit from the Florida coast.
Copy all. Good luck and Godspeed.
So the work has been
Dragon
done.
SpaceX, we confirm nominal
The launch has been completed. America has rejoined the ranks of spacefaring nations, launching from its own soil, its own astronauts, its own rockets. We will be returning now to the NASA feed, direct for about another 15 or so minutes. This is Time Magazine reporting from Kennedy Space Center in Florida and the Time headquarters in New York City. We have witnessed history today, and we've witnessed a return to America as a leader in the world of spacefaring nations.
Environmental control and life support system. That's everything controlling their atmosphere, just keeping Dragon a nice, safe, habitable environment where they're going to be living for the next 19 hours until they arrive at the space station.
Right, exactly. And Falcon 9's job may be done for today, but the mission is not over. Crew Dragon's job is not done. As you can see, Bob and Doug are still inside Crew Dragon, making their way. It will be a 19-hour trip to the International Space Station before they dock tomorrow morning. And such cool views. I love that we can get these live views here and see and watch what they're doing now that they are in orbit.
Yeah, it's incredible to just be looking over their shoulder, to be along for the ride. And we're going to be with them, and we're going to be with all of you the entire way for their journey to the space station. We're going to be covering live throughout. Bob and Doug will obviously have a sleep period where they'll get about 8 hours of sleep a little bit later today before they wake up for all of their final approach. One of the major things we are looking forward to in the next couple of hours is going to be their first turn at the controls. So they're actually going to be using those touchscreen displays to take control and manually pilot Dragon. We'll walk you through what that's going to look like, and assuming we have some good ground station coverage, we'll be able to get views from right inside Dragon, looking over their shoulder as they manipulate the controls at the display. But I mean, we had a smooth ride uphill, both stages of the Falcon 9 doing their job, placing Bob and Doug into orbit. I mean, this is a day, this is a historical day. This is us kicking off that new era of space flight that we've all been talking about and longing for since the space shuttle program came to an end in 2011.
Yes.
And the weather cooperated.
Yes, second time's a charm.
Right.
All right, so day for the history books. As you can see, we have lost some live signal there, but the mission still continues, and we're going to send it over to KSC to continue broadcasting live with you.
Loss of signal, Newfoundland.